Hello and welcome here to Boundless and Bottomless Seas Extra. I think I've called these supplementary episodes five different things. We'll see which one sticks. And today I'm talking to Jules Taylor, host slash producer of the Noisy Answers podcast, producer of a lot of podcasts. What are you producing these days, Jules?
I think I got five. So I've got No Easy Answers, which has been around the longest that I've done. And then got Working People when I work with Max Alvarez on like weekly shows. I've started this new thing called the Corpus Christi Songwriter Podcast, which is some in real life friends that are musicians, and we hang out and talk about songwriting. We have other guest songwriters on, and so there's some surprisingly sort of philosophical stuff that comes up during the course of those conversations, and it's quickly becoming one of my favorite things to do is just have conversations with songwriters. And the other two that I have, the most recent unveiling is something I'm doing with Anders Lee of the Pod Damn America podcast, uh, called The Vanquished, and it's about ex-presidential candidates. And I also have something that I'm really proud of with Judy Gearhart called The Labor Link, and we just did a couple episodes on South Asia. She traveled to Indonesia, Cambodia, and Thailand to gather interviews with exploited migrant fisher workers and fisher worker organizers there, and that's all on laborlinkpodcast.org. So that's five, and that's too many, and I'm making it work, you know. So yeah, thanks for asking about all five of those, or asking how many I do, because it's rare I get to mention all of them as well, you know.
Yeah, it's funny how a lot of our projects like overlap but don't get brought up. Um, yeah, as a person who works, I mean, I named my podcast after my own name so I could do whatever the fuck I wanted to with it, which was a tricky little thing on my part. Um, and it's really easy to remember my name because it's a four-letter word,
Right.
which is appropriate. So today we're talking about Alexander Dugin, who unfortunately or fortunately has been in my world for too fucking long. I've known about Dugin since about 2007, 2008. When I left the paleo conservative world, which was adjacent to what was then called radical traditionalism, later on a splinter part of that would become the alt right. Um, and then another splinter part of that would become the fourth political position, um, vaguely aligned with Greca and the European New Right in France in particular, but also in Spain and Germany. Um, Dugin's a hard figure to get your brain around because he was important in the Russian academic scene. He seems to have been very recently courted again by Russian universities, so he might be back on the ascent within Russian academia. I don't know what that means exactly. However, he is also in some ways a coffee house post-fascist, to put it, in that he was hanging out with Mark Lemanoff in back in the day. He used to hang out with a bunch of occultists, and I knew him from these occultists who hung around paleo conservatives in the aughts and aught teens. Then he came back up for me during the end of the Obama administration, when there were a bunch of people coming in from the right trying to do entryism into the radical left sphere of anti-imperialism, because we sound similar, and people around like Arctos Press, everyone's favorite weird post-fascist press out of India, run by an American and a New Zealand ex-Nazi, um,
Yeah.
started printing his stuff in English with Mark Shibobda, who is I think he was his assistant at University of Moscow before he got canned in 2013. Was also a guy in the Russia Today slash Gray Zone, frankly, orbit.
Mhm.
Um, I also know personally and is a person who used to reach out to leftists, but he got kicked out of some paleo-conservative groups for being too anti-gay and too anti-immigrant.
Wow.
So when people see this guy talking on left podcast, they should know that about him.
Right.
So that was my, 2 steps removed from the world of Alexander Dugin. I remember calling out that when Caleb Maupin was still the head of the Workers' World Party of the WWP, of which the PSL is a split, just so people get their orientation here. Maupin was hanging around a lot of people around Shibobda, and when he got caught at that conference and then went MAGA communism, it was the least surprising thing ever. I was seeing him develop in that direction as early as 2011, 2012. So over 10 years ago. And I wanted to talk to you about that because I haven't, I've hinted at some of this stuff in public, but I haven't really talked about it explicitly directly because I've never known what to make of it. When you encounter these people, it can make you feel like you're involved in a bigger conspiracy, and yet also this liberal tendency to make Dugin more than he was, particularly during the Trump administration, meant that it was very hard to talk about him because I was like, dude, this guy may or may not be trying to infiltrate a bunch of different things. In an episode that I haven't released by the time we're recording this, but I will release before this comes out, I actually talk explicitly in chapter 2 of Fourth Political Theory where he says he's going to use Marxist-Leninists as a fifth column because of a mythic structure they have of their mythic anti-Americanism. And so when people like Vox and the Russiagate crowd come out and scream this, it actually hurts to talk about it because it's like, no, he said this explicitly. This is not a Russiagate conspiracy. This is a stated tactic in the book. And one that hadn't really worked until very recently. And the proliferation of Dugin-esque talking points, even from people who don't know that's where it's coming from, on the left has been sort of startling to me, even though at the same time I've been trying to remind people, hey, there are more important Russian thinkers. They're just not often translated into English and they're not aimed at a foreign audience the way Dugin is. So what do you make of that? How did you get involved in Duginology?
Sure. So there's a lot there, man. I would say that there seems to be a thread through someone like a Frank Meyer, who was an apparatchik for the Communist Party, I want to say in the 40s, and he ended up reading The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, and slowly this sort of turned his ideology away from the Communist Party, which was I think at this point, this was during the Bowderism age, of CPUSA. But Frank Meyer eventually just basically turned the other side of the political spectrum, embraced rightism, ended up being really chummy and writing articles with William Buckley. And so part of what I've done in my own studies has been hey, I had an episode with Rob Larson where, he wrote a book-length rebuttal against the Road to Serfdom. And it's what are these arguments? Why was someone like Frank Meyer finding these arguments compelling? And that thread sort of pulled me into thinking about how maybe there are many roads into soliciting. Otherwise, what we think of, it's startling because we think of these comrades as, we say comrades, right? But we think of them as principled, thinkers that are somehow convinced by these. I'm on this end I'm in a left media bubble because I've heard the arguments on the other side, and I think they're all bullshit. And so when one of these arguments makes its way in, either via the avenue of anti-capitalism, the avenue of anti-Americanism, the avenue of anti-imperialism, which seems to be the avenue that gains Duginists the most results, right? It's just why these arguments pull people to the other side. And it makes you feel like they never believed in the principles to begin with. And so it's startling. And it's, I guess, what I've learned out of I feel like I speak a lot on politics, but I'm also somewhat of I only really got into politics around 2015-ish. Like that's not a very long time. You've been in this game for a very long time to have gone through ideologies and settled into who you are and your politics and your philosophy and your outlooks on the world. And and so I'm in the practice of always looking at my own ideology and taking a battle axe or a pickaxe to it and really trying to sharpen my own ideological blade in a way. Because I want to be a staunch defender of the words I speak and the things I believe. And it's our own personal duty, I feel like, to do that. Right. So when you asked me about how I got into Duginism, it was really through understanding that, like, if you're in left politics, there seems to always be an attrition of like otherwise valuable principled comrades that will just be siphoned from the other side through shitty arguments. That otherwise, I mean, I'm sitting over here feeling like I've heard these arguments, these are old hat. Someone else hasn't, and someone else just that argument got them, and that sucks. And so when I started to, before I was researching Dugin, I was feeling this sort of attrition of people that, and being someone who was kind of new to organizing around 2019, 2020, I started to see people in like people I knew in real life who all of a sudden were like, went from organizing like tenant unions to like refuting Thomas Malthus, like to just like all of a sudden it's about the population, it's about the Malthusians who want to eliminate part of the population, and it's a battle against wokeness, and a lot of these topics come up within the sort of Duginist circles as well. There's like, it's almost like I've heard Dugin described as what he's trying to orchestrate as like a sort of ecumenical genocide, or I'm sorry, ecumenical jihad, in the way that like he wants to gather all the disparate sort of ideologies that aren't strong enough on their own to combat liberalism and bring them all together, and then going back to like Caleb Maupin, when he says shit like I don't care if you're for abortion or against it, but I will organize with you or something, and people see that as a calling card to invite fascists into a movement. It's the same thing with Dugin and this ecumenical jihad thing. It's a very similar concept in that, and my thought process is like, hey, like I don't think America deserves to exist, but it's for very, very different reasons. And
yeah,
and so like how someone like Dugin can assuage like comrades and pull them into shit like through avenues of anti-imperialism or avenues of anti-capitalism or whatever. That was one thing, and the other thing was just like this constant attrition that's going to happen, and watching these things happen in real time. I don't, that doesn't answer the question completely, but it seemed like when I read Benjamin Teitelbaum's book, it kind of became clear how, it didn't become all clear at once. It took a lot of research to understand who Dugin is and what how he sees the world in order to understand this sort of funnel of how he's pulling people into this sort of, turning them into Eurasianists, turning them into multipolarity people, and instead of communists that focus on the working class, it's like this. He really twists ideologies, and that itself was compelling to find out how he could take like an anti-imperialist and make them champion the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So all this stuff was like seemingly very confusing, and I needed to figure it out because, like you said, like people are spouting this stuff without realizing where these talking points are coming from. They're not realizing what language they're using and where that originates from and to what ends, who profits from their usage of that kind of terminology and language and perspectives. And so, yeah, there's a lot there, man. I don't know if I answered any of those questions, I got into Dugin just because I was watching comrades fucking fall, man, and I was like, what the fuck is this, man? So
Well, not to pick on you too hard, but Marxist Leninists have this tendency.
right, as I've
Um,
discovered, right, yeah, and as I've been a Marxist Leninist, I've had to sort of distance myself from some of this shit as it's gone down, because it's like there's a lot of Dugianism in there, and there's a lot of weird Sorelianism. This stuff kind of pops up, and wish I had kind of been given a heads up about this instead of having to discover it in real time. But yeah,
well, one thing I'll say, the history of fascism is a history of liberalism in crisis in the broad sense, and I will, point that out, that there's a continuity. Like, the reason why it's hard to talk about what fascism was, is that if you look at liberal politics or even social democratic politics, the right wing of liberalism, the right wing of social democracy, the right wing of blood and soil conservatism all play a part in the creation of fascism. But one thing that Marxists tend to avoid, and it's the what I like to call, we all avoid it because of stupid Jonah Gerberg arguments, 20 years ago or whatever. Is the liberal fascism, where one, the left and liberals are conflated together. But I read The Apprentice's Sorcerer, which is a great book, but I kept on wanting to throw Z.F. Sternhall at its face. And that is the fact that Marxists, by and large, while they do not come from the same class orientation as fascist and post-fascist and other reactionary groups, meaning that our class base tends to be working class, and frankly lumpen. Theirs tend to be lumpen and petit bourgeoisie, the working but non-wage earning poor. So they're related classes, but they're not the same. But the leadership, all right, of the fascist movement, by and large, has a disproportionate calling card of either National Bolsheviks or former Marxists, and that goes all the way back to Mussolini himself.
yeah,
And that misrecognition is super common. Like, for example, Karl Reddick in the 1930s really got himself in some deep shit supporting some not National Socialists, and I don't mean Nazis, but they ended up being Nazis anyway, but they weren't Nazis yet, who later on, as soon as he was endorsing them as part of like this view of a broad front under Zinoviev, ended up, and it may have been this was the 20s, not the 30s, excuse me, ended up killing communists. All right, like, this is a habit of misrecognition that we have, because people will throw socialism up in our face and people will throw anti-imperialism up in our face, and that trend goes all the way back to OG fascism. It is not new. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is like, we need to recognize that this is not like a natural deviation of Marxism, in my point of view. It's a tendency that can emerge when we get frustrated with the working class, or we try to adopt statist or class collaborationist views. And by statist here, I'm not an anarchist. I don't think we can overthrow the state tomorrow. But like, when we start seeing that that's just the goal in and of itself, that we just have to take power and stop there, and then we provide some kind of social well-being for the working class and stop there. All right, it's class collaboration, it's politics, and in America, that can sound really good, honestly, because we have so little. The joke my friend used to say is like, Marxists always have to fight trade union consciousness, except in the United States, where they're just hoping to get even that. It's kind of it's kind of a sad truth. Dugin's interesting to me, and other people like him. Keith Preston, the right-wing anarchist, used to run this thing called Attack the System, was adjacent to the alt-right. There have been a long series of people who really tried to do red-brown stuff. The problem that I've had in trying to talk about this is, one, the people who become red-brown chasers tend to end up working for liberals or even the State Department. And two, they always cast their net way, way too wide. So, you know, they might include me in their red brown stuff because I come from a right wing background and I know these people, and I'm like 3 steps removed from some. In the case of Dugin, I'm literally 2 steps removed from some of these people. And so if you're drawing your little like, oh, this guy knows this guy on the chart, you can get a lot of people who new defectors are defectors from the other side and just throw them in with the red brown menace. And I also do think to a large degree liberals vastly overstate the red brown threat. But the thing is, it's not a threat. I remember Donald Parkinson of Cosmon and I used to argue back and forth about how serious we should take the red brown stuff. And then he realized that LaRoucheism was going to be a problem and it was coming back. And then he became more sympathetic to my view that while the red brown stuff is not the main enemy at all, I mean, the main enemy still is in capitalism. Since I'm a classical Marxist, that goes first, then imperialism, that goes second, because I see that as an epiphenomenon of capitalism. If you're a Maoist, you reverse the two. But nonetheless, that's where our worldview really is, right? I think all tendencies of Marxism can go this way. So when I made fun of Marxist-Leninists, but Trotskyists can easily become neoconservatives and other things. That's not made up. Maoists are all over the place in the ways that they've deviated, particularly in response to the Sino-Soviet split, but also a lot of former Maoists ended up in the right wing of French politics, if you know that history. David Horowitz was a Maoist at one point too. I mean, so like, make of that what you will. Soc Dems, well, I mean, they're the vast majority of defectors to fascism were the right wing of social democracy as early as the Freikorps. So they can't get out of it. There's no tendency in anarchism. Well, the national syndicalist movement's one of the basis for fascism in the first place, which does have a direct relationship to anarchism. You can't get around that. There is no left tendency that does not get touched by these kinds of movements. And in America, I think the other problematic legacy that we have is we have to admit uncomfortably that unlike in Europe, where anti-imperialism was almost explicitly a liberal and or left-wing thing, in the United States, the right has been split on imperialism from moment one, going back to the fucking Confederates. Because there was one section of the Confederates who were filibusters who were trying to try to do imperial Confederate expansion even after the Civil War. And there's another thread of ex-Confederates who decided that imperialism was a mistake that put all the people of color in their countries in the first place, and that we shouldn't expand because, brown people. And so, for example, some of the opposition to the Mexican-American War, came from people who would later be in the Confederacy and also people who would be in the Anti-Imperialist League on the right. So that history in the United States is very real. I mean, if you look at who opposed World War II, you get like John Dewey and then a bunch of like para-fascists like the silver shirts and shit. So it's a really mixed, really odd group of people. Dugin seems to have concocted a really heady ideology that if you don't read it, one, it can feel like popular frontism. All right. Now, I am not a popular frontist because I'm like, I tend to be a classical Marxist, and I think the United Front is defendable. The Popular Front isn't. But, that's a fine distinction. I mean, basically the distinction in Europe is that you won't sit in a government and you won't empower a government that has bourgeois parties in it. But you might work with them on specific things while you wouldn't sit in them in like a government cabinet or whatever. That's part of the difference. There's two forms of united frontism too. These words kind of don't mean much anymore. And the other problem is they don't like when Marxist Leninist or Trotskyist or Maoist try to bring them into the United States. The problem is those strategies, both United and Popular Front, are not designed for a constitutional system like the United States. They're designed for a parliamentary mixed government system. So we just don't know what to do with them. So we throw those words around, but they don't really mean much. A Popular Front in the United States means you subordinate yourself to the Democratic Party.
Right.
A United Front means I don't know. I think it means like you work with non-communist unions, and you'll work with activist groups, and you might aid the Democrats in a particular action, but you're never gonna like endorse them. But again, we're not in a country that has a fluid party system and mixed in proportional representational government. So those questions are somewhat just not relevant here. Dugin really, the anti-imperialism thing is interesting because multipolarity, which isn't invented by Dugin, I want to also make that very clear. Multipolarity is like actually early 20th century British geopolitics that was picked up, and people forget this, by center and right-wing critics of neoconservatives in the mid-aughts. They are like, hey, we're heading to a multipolar world. You just have to accept it. Fareed Zakaria was actually the first time I saw that book, that in a major book. Dugin, who was writing his book actually in that framework. I mean, we have to remember that he's writing it 2006, 2007, 2008. It's published in Russia, maybe 2009. We get it in 2012. It kind of takes almost 10 years to really permeate. And one of the things that seemed to help it permeate was liberals trying to pretend that Dugin was somehow Putin's Rasputin. That actually seemed to have helped Dugin in a very real way. And then the Ukraine-Russia war, where NATO pulled some shit. Where I'm not gonna lie. Like I do not support the Russian invasion, but I also from a crude realist geopolitical standpoint, I completely understand why it happened. Right. And I do think U.S. imperial nonsense in regards to it taking advantage of chaos in Ukraine from probably 2004 onward is what led us here. Also, our actions in Georgia and Moldova and during the Yugoslav wars. So there's a long history there of which, some of the stuff coming out of fans of Putin is pretty legitimate. However, as I've said to other people, that if you really believe the Russian invasion was justifiable, you also kind of actually have to believe that the invasion of Iraq was justifiable because it's a preemptive strike.
Yeah, man.
And that's the logic.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you said about like all of every left tendency is susceptible to this stuff. It's like I feel like, I did some research on cults for a bit, and it's kind of like, I don't think anyone becomes a Duginist overnight, in the same way that I don't think like sane, rational, sound-minded individuals join a cult in one day, right? It's like a slow drip process of it has to do with maybe like some media diet stuff, some unwitting agents of this stuff, and at some point Dugin pops on your radar a little bit, and he checks a few of these boxes, and I think you've said before on on an episode that I believe you said something like, there's so many ideologies in the world, and none of them do a good job at explaining the world or deciphering the way it is. And so there's part of me that doesn't really hold these people in contempt for finding an ideology they feel explains the world to them in a way that, I don't know, as they feel is most adequate or something, or that is the most functional working model for them. But I also think that, like, Marxists, we don't do a good job of acknowledging this stuff, right? Like, and in the same way that like liberals don't really do a good job of acknowledging the things that Dugin points out, like the sort of Schmittian totalitarian lurking behind the shadows of that liberalism is always yearning for. You know, the totalitarianism via presupposing universalisms, right, of like human rights and things that way, of like this is, you know, and this comes down to the enmity of like first principle disagreements of what constitutes the good life. And so I when I got into Dugin and I was doing research on him, part of what compelled me to continue reading about him and learning more was that Dugin was reading and quoting some of the same philosophers that I revered, but he was taking ideas towards fascistic ends from these same writings that I had read. And it was so greatly offensive to me that, like, even like I'm hesitant to even give Dugin any sort of verbal credit on any ideas that may be interesting or useful or what have you within his writings, because I'm just dead set against like not beautifying any of the guy's work or what he's done. And I don't think his ideas are things that like the left or Marxism or Marxists have to take up and use for themselves. Like I don't see him as that kind of writer. I see him as someone who is taking our own weapons and using them against us. And while it's useful to examine him in the same way that one might read Heidegger, not in the way that you're trying to take Heideggerianism and you're not trying to pull a Marcuse here and start using that language and start, you know, really adopting Heideggerianism, but you're simply learning from his techniques so that you can better be equipped to, you know, using your own organizing, like and to avoid these sort of entrapments that that inevitably will snag some of us, you know, because we're all susceptible to it. And you know, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow drip of talking points and pithy things that maybe have to do with a media diet or something. So, you know, and I also think that like part of this has to do with you know, there's some false sort of Russian history mixed in here that makes up this whole concept of like a uniting of a Slavic people. There's like the Charles Clover book really highlights a lot of this stuff, like the Lev Gumilyev guy who wrote a lot of the Slavic history while in prison and not having access to notebooks and stuff, you know, which is a crazy interesting character to read about. To, you know, he survived the founding of the USSR and was an activist against it his whole life, and then, you know, wept when the USSR fell in '91. It's just a bizarre, wild story to read about that way. But I would say that, like, you know, Duginism kind of plugs and plays a lot of different ideologies with him. You know, whether you're Marxist-Leninist and you're anti-United States and anti-imperialist, you can plug and play within sort of his outlook. You know, you can pick up Eurasianism as part of that too, and it kind of, you know, is congruent with feelings of wishing for the United States downfall, for multipolarity, for and as a Marxist, I mean, I feel like, you know, the United States is the greatest purveyor of war and death and arms across the entire world, and in many ways, I feel like the United States has to fall for the world to get to a better place. So I'm partly sympathetic with these arguments as well, but do I buy in and go blind into that project under like just and not just turn the horse blinders on and be like, no, this actually isn't Russian expansionism. No, this isn't you know, Russian fascism. No, like you actually have to like be blind to that shit or turn that shit off or not acknowledge it, or be in extreme bad faith to not understand that once you get far enough into the stuff, like that's what this is. It's all a vehicle for Russian expansion, which was part of why, you know, in reading Foundations of Geopolitics and 4PT, in the original episode I made about this, which I was very hesitant to, and we've talked about how like talking about this stuff was very harmful at one point. Just talking about it fed the entire problem. And so I didn't feel like it was necessary to really be forthright with a lot of the stuff I had read about until the invasion of Ukraine happened. And during that episode, you know, I said that Russia would expand out further west than just Ukraine. And I did take some slack on it. I mentioned the country of Poland, and like as it's been a couple of years now since that episode's out, and Dugin has kind of, there was that whole episode with his car bomb and his daughter dying, and a lot has happened since then. But at its core, I feel like this is still. I feel like Russia will take advantage of any opportunity to expand out, given that there are so many cracks within NATO's armor, given the latest things that have happened between Iran and Israel. And, when I listen to someone like Norm Finkelstein say that, like, for once, the world felt like the U.S. Or Israel was not indefeatable, like Goliath could have been taken down by David. Part of me takes that statement and understands that, like, the Russians are watching the situation too, and Dugin is well aware of this stuff. And as far back as '97 and Foundations of Geopolitics, he was like, "Yo, we need to encourage the U.S. to stoke divisions along racial and class lines. We need the UK to leave the EU." And he's talking about all these soft power techniques that we've seen happen in various degrees. Whether it's Trump talking about getting out of NATO, whether it's Boris talking about getting out of the EU, and all these chinks in the armor will be opportunities for further sort of affronts on American hegemony, on liberal hegemony. So I think we're at the start of a huge wave here, and I don't think we're even at a point where, like, when I said about Poland, that, like, I think that could still happen, man. And anything could happen, but I think that's not out of the realm of possibilities. Further expansion that way, because ultimately all this stuff seems like just a vehicle for that.
So to pick up on what you said, I want to talk about, like, the implications of the multipolarity for a minute. I am a multipolarista in the sense that since 2005, 2006, 2007, I've thought that the American empire was born out of hubris in 1992. That while I didn't buy stuff like Maoist third worldism because their schemas don't make a lot of sense to me, I had a friend of the show, Kevin of Regrettable Century, come on recently and say he's a third worldist because the social democracy bought off the working class, and we needed the third world to rise up, and blah 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 blah. And I pointed out to him that, well, the weird part about that is, if that were true, it makes no sense, the time frame, because the 1950s was the beginning of the U.S. empire, and it was not in a unipolar world. It was in a bipolar world, one where a lot of the social democratic stuff actually came as a buy-off for potential workers' movements within the U.S. because Russia had proved it was possible.
Right.
Now, they were bought off, but I don't think they were bought off just off of the profits of the third world, because trade with the third world, development of the third world, actually has declined in the 20th century, with the exception of China, which I do not think you can actually say is still part of the periphery of the planet. You might agree with Wallerstein that semi-periphery, are like me, that it's basically core now. I don't see how you're not core when you're one of the largest three economies on the planet, both in productivity and in terms of wealth. The issue that I have, I guess, that's similar to yours, is while NATO expansion is a given and its failure is a given, I think NATO's hit its nadir. In fact, I've been arguing now for 5 years that a lot of what we're seeing about the incoherence in U.S. politics is there's a faction of the U.S. imperial establishment, and it's probably actually a dominant faction in the army. It was around Mad Dog Mateus and people like him, who want to Hadrian's all off the empire. Like, they're not going to be soft on Iran. They're not going to be soft on, certain things, on even certain things Trump wanted to be soft on. They definitely weren't anti-NATO, but they had learned from 2001 to 2006 that the empire just can't. Interestingly, today, that faction seems to be represented in the popular media by liberal realists such as Peter Zion, who are like, yeah, China's our number one enemy, but we don't have to go to war with China. We just have to like step back and let their demographic crisis do the work for us. And we're just not going to maintain the global deep water trade lines anymore, and the rest of the world's fucked. But since there's no Belt and Road Initiative anymore, and that's actually kind of Russia's fault, then we don't have to do much. We just have to step back, help Ukraine not lose, and not even win, just not lose. And I mean, the implication in Peter Zion's things is they were totally willing to sacrifice Ukraine to like have a bleeding Afghanistan a la 1987 in Europe. And that's implied in what they're saying. But that's all they have to do. The other side that's a Hadrian's Wall side, but is different, is the Mersheimer school of realists who want détente with Russia, who are generally soft on are not pro-war, but they want a war with China, and the way they see as a way to get the war with China is to spin off the tensions between Russia and China, particularly over some of the results of the Belt and Road Initiative collapsing under the rate of Russia's actions, and using that as leverage to turn Russia against China, and moving forward from there. India is already in an interesting place. India is pro-Russia, anti-China. That goes back a long time, all the way back to the tensions between Zhou Enlai and the Congress Party, in the Bundang period of so these fields, I think, is interesting. Dugin's interesting to me, because he seems to actually be pretty clueless about certain aspects of the United States, but really believe like what the online left said at the time of like 2008, 2009. He repeats them as facts in his books, which is kind of funny. It's just like, so he actually doesn't have that great of a read on US culture. But what he does have is a pretty good read on the fractions and factionation within, let's say, the transatlantic superstate, the imperial core, the core. Use whatever system you want, but he's aware of these tensions, like. And I remember telling people in 2016 that, like, you guys think Trump is the beginning of a wave, but for me, he's actually the end of it. Like this, he is a figure that we have seen emerge in a lot of places, a kind of Cordelia-like, Bonapartist-like, but not a true Bonaparte. They're not really able to pull off actual Bonapartism, figure that comes out of a populist right-wing movement rejecting parts of the right. Well, we saw this all over Europe in the aughts. And Dugin was watching that. And he watched even the further stuff, the rebirth of National Bolshevism in Europe as a real viable movement. Now, is it actually in danger of taking over most of Europe? No, but it has influence on people who are, such as Le Pen. And if Macron cannot hold out, I do not see the victor being Mélenchon. I see it being Le Pen, and which puts us in a weird position, because none of us should actually want the EU to survive. None of us should want NATO to survive. You talk about the United States. I mean, I think all these institutions, as governments and polities, are totally reprobate. Like, and in that sense, when I first encountered Dugin in 2008, 2009, and and then in 2011, when Shabovda and people were in my orbit and I was abroad, I was in South Korea at the time and working on left stuff, but mainly through blogging. I was not yet a podcaster. I actually could see the appeal coming from a paleo-conservative background. I have been an anti-imperialist as a right-winger, right? This is my own background.
Mm-hmm.
And I am still fans of certain conservative-ish, small c conservative anti-imperialists, such as Andrew Basovich over there at the Quincy Institute, etc. You know, he's a paleo conservatism who's like gotten slightly more woke on race in the last 20 years.
Hmm.
You know? Read good books. You know, if you were in that milieu that also created people like Jimmy Dore and whatnot, it's a very Gen X against the center mentality. And what I find interesting about it, and I'm going to throw this at you, and then we can talk about some of the other places where Dugin has influence. It's wild. I mean,
Yeah.
Is that it made it feel to me like the financial crisis and the impending this view of the left dealing with domestic affairs during the entirety of my childhood in the aughts in my 20s. The left's sole focus, since it had no effect on domestic affairs, was international affairs. All right. Where it also had no effect, but it could be loud and no one really held it accountable for being wrong or whatever. Like it just, you know, you could take a good moral stance. And since it had no domestic, you know, actual implications, you could be on the side of the Angels with Pat Buchanan and also a Baba Bacon and all those people, you
Mm.
know, and Nason and Coate Way. Uh, the frenemy of the show, Chris Catrone, and my one of my bet nors / mentors, a very complicated relationship with Chris, but pointed out that the 2008 crisis actually made class and domestic economy something that the left in the United States cared about and focused on. But what is interesting about that is for some fucking reason we can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. And also our allegiance with the Democrats meant that we ignored, with very few exceptions, the extent of the fact that after Bush, the empire was still pushing along pretty damn well. Libya happened, woke some people up. There are some people who were woken up by the, you know, some even liberalish people like Gary Wills who were woken up by the Obama's refusal to do anything but escalate in Afghanistan, which, by the way, shouldn't have surprised anybody. That's what he actually said, but yet people were surprised by it. But outside of those things, and then during the Trump administration, since Trump did not really have a bellicose foreign policy, this did not come back up. We turned away from international anything. All right. So the irony of the rebirth of an American social democratic left was that it emerged at a time where we went from being all oriented towards international to not oriented towards the international at all. We just ignored it.
Yeah.
We let empire go on because it seemed like maybe it was ramping itself down. But we weren't really paying that much attention. Let's be honest. You know, Trump kills an Iranian general, people kill again, but in general, uh, the left was unaware of view, and those who were particularly aligned to the Democrats took a weirdly pro NATO stance, and a weirdly. I remember people getting really mad about Trump making forays with peace with North Korea, and I'd be like, "What are you on? If like Trump does this will be a net good for the world." You know, this is bad.
Yeah.
Like you know, the isolation, like I don't love the DPRK regime. I'm not generally a DPRK defensist, but like my stance is NATO needs to leave it alone, and that if if it didn't have a constant foreign threat, some stuff would probably be worked out that would not be as reactionary as it currently seems to in the DPRK. So, you know, these are my stances. They've kind of been my stances for a long time. Um, and I see the appeal of Dugin. Where I'm with you though, Jules, is I don't want to give like I on my panel, Jason wants to give Dugin a lot of credit, and I tend not to. And I think
Yeah.
part of it is because I actually know what Dugan's pulling from more. I'm more familiar with right wing literature. So I know that, like, I haven't found an idea in there that's unique to Dugin. What's
Right,
unique is
man.
the
Yeah.
weird panoply of just bizarro shit he throws at you from 80 different sources at once. Now, he does it quite intelligently. He's an intelligent synthesizer, and I will give him credit for that. But, like, even some of his really weird arguments, like he has a broader definition of racism than Robin DiAngelo. Like, as I point out in a
Well,
recent episode.
well, this is like I was telling you before we got on here. I listened to a lot of your stuff and Daniel Tutt, and it's occurred to me that like there's a through line from like Nietzsche to Evola to Dugin taken straight from this stuff in terms of like trying to do what Evola failed to do, which was reinvigorate fascism with a booster shot of spirituality in a more Mussolinian sort of form of spiritual racism, in a way that like it's wild to me because you read this stuff in 4PT and you're right, there's not original ideas. The novel part of this is the way he quilts these disparate ideas together to form a slightly coherent it's more of like it's a very heady ideology. I think Daniel called it like it reads like a work of like Heideggerian messianicism or something like that is what he said.
Oh
um,
yeah, I would
you
say
know
in the second and third chapter of the book, there's like Heidegger. I mean, the one thing, my big thing though, when I say Dugin's a post-fascist, I put emphasis though that it's not a total rejection because his favorite Heidegger is Nazi period Heidegger. It's
yeah,
1936 to
right,
1945. It's
right.
just like the lost Heidegger that no one talks about for whatever reason. I have no idea.
Yeah.
There's also things that Dugin does, and maybe he's trying to get past Russian censors because you can't legally be a Nazi in Russia. But some of it I think is sincere. I think he does not like Nazi racism. Well, partly because it was aimed at Slavs, not just Jews, and partly because he realizes the multipolar world. One of the things people ignore about it is that it's still an imperial world. It is an inter-imperial world. You have multiple empires. And so a racialist ideology, when you're trying to maintain what is effectively the former Russian world and the sphere of influence of the Russian Empire, which is the Orthodox slash Shiite Muslim slash Buddhist world of the 19th century Russian Empire, is not copacetic with racism. All right. Now, he does seem to be sincerely anti-universalist, but one of the things I pointed out is I was like, well, it's interesting to me, however, that he's not like advocating for like a pan-Europeanism in an answer, in a block that's separate from the Eurasian bloc. He wants the Europeans to adopt national Bolshevism, which would fragment them. Right.
I think also he wants to there's plans for like European domination through foundations of geopolitics. And I know that he even states in there, like, these are like kind of just a dream. We can aspire to do this one day, but when I surf the internet and find memes of like Europe doesn't exist, it's actually just an Asian peninsula. It's hard for me to think that like these thoughts and these sort of, the way that those memes bounce around in your head, if that's not like ultimately some idea that was like, that's a Eurasianist sort of thing, Teitelbaum wrote about Dugin meeting with Steve Bannon and Steve Bannon trying to convince Dugin to abandon sort of, I don't know, whatever praise he has for Iran or as an allyship or something. But, Dugin in his traditionalism really sees like the epitome of like sort of a truth, beauty, and insight achieved through a government that ideally looks something like Iran, like a sort of, a theocracy. And he says, he affirms this so much when he says, like, what does the West care if our president is sacred? Like there is this infusion of religion that he's, and this is why the sort of Christo-fascists, love Russia. It's he's attempting to do what Evola failed to do, which is bring fascism, which, as he says, is a more consistent fascism, or a borderless and red fascism. But I think he's trying to do this in an Evolian sort of way by bringing Christianity and spirituality, theocracy sort of aspects into the sort of modern version of Russian revanchism.
Yeah, and that's not new. I mean, that's older than fascism. I mean,
right.
I pointed out that, like I was saying, he also pretends that certain people who he calls revolutionary conservatives, there were revolutionary conservatives in Germany. Ernst Junger, I've done a whole show on them.
Right.
And they were anti-fascist. They were also fascistic in many ways, but they were anti-fascist. They hated Hitler. They hated his modernism and his biologicism, if nothing else. But I will note that Dugin will hide actual fascists in that group. So he'll mention Schmidt as one of these conservative revolutionaries. Schmidt was not a conservative revolutionary; he's fascist explicitly. So whenever he encounters a fascist that he wants to use, it's a German fascist. Because again, I think A, Nazism is illegal in Russia still, and B, he does not seem to really want to get into the whole. He does. Racism seems to bother him, but I want to point out that there's stuff in there in his view of anti-racism that's based on like the human biodiversity movement and whatnot, which is still like racial purist movements. It's just like separate but acknowledged, except for Europe, which they really want. And while yes, I also call Europe the dangly bits off Asia. I'm not a Eurasianist. One of the interesting things about the Eurasian vision is I don't see how eventually it doesn't come in direct conflict with China, because like they would almost have to. And there's this undercurrent in the current like détente, and I say détente between Russia and China because in Russia and China official statements they never say anything bad about each other. But I pointed out that during the beginning of the Ukraine war, China did not suppress anti-Russian protest. And they also didn't suppress pro-Russian protests. It was pretty clear that the government took a moderately pro-Russia stance, but did not go so far as to suppress internal dissent about it, which they had even done like during the second Iraq war. I mean, like, so clearly parts of this created tensions for China and Russia. One of the things I think is that geopolitically, China thought it was going to be able to spin Europe away from the US's orbit and closer to it. The Russia-Ukraine war has made sure that's not going to happen for 50 to 100 years. Like, Macron will occasionally throw China a bone, but like right now, like, and I know it's hard for Americans to see, but anti-Russian sentiment in Europe is probably way higher than anti-Russian sentiment in the United States. And in some ways it's because there's actual fear there. There's a fear of returning to the Cold War. There's a fear of Russian expansionism. There's a fear that Europe is just less and less relevant to the world. And I know many Europeans will probably balk at that. Some will agree with me, but just in general, as Germany's become more of an economic basket case, the EU is just not as important in the grand scheme of things. It increasingly looks like India, China, the United States as the aging not unilateral hegemon, but like the first hegemon amongst not quite equals. In Russia, which is somewhat consolidated, although it's having a lot of economic, like Russia during the war has gone in and out of economic problems. The thing is, none of those economic problems have looked anything like what the sanctions regime promises on the West would have indicated.
Yeah.
Which I don't know why anyone thought it would. If you've ever looked at sanctions, they don't do what liberals say. They've never done what liberals say they're going to do. They actually tend to consolidate an internal economy and then like get people to do war Keynesianism, but it also like opens up trade problems. It leads to highly unstable currency, depending on the cycles of trade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we've seen in Russia. But and Russia has interestingly gone from like trying to do the Western high-tech war stuff to it's just now just doing old-fashioned artillery. It's funny how ultimately it often comes to that. And of course it can outproduce Ukraine and even probably the West, because the West is not trying to do a massive artillery infrastructure buildup. So we're going to see a lot of that stuff play out. I think, a friend of mine says whenever you meet a Marxist, you always have to ask yourself, are they dreaming about anti-imperialism because they want workers to be free? Or are they dreaming about anti-imperialism because they want a different empire in charge? And that has got to be the question that guides you on this question, like on these questions. Like I generally support loosely national liberation from imperial powers. I generally support loosely decolonization. Although I will say decolonization ultimately ended up with the elites of the developing world shaking hands with parts of the elites that developed. It's a fact, particularly after 1992, when the USSR was no longer there to really support the developmental regimes that it helped establish. And that's a problem. All right. Well, Dugin though picks up on that resentment. And another thing that you pointed out to me, and this is what's wild. Okay, so you have Marxist-Leninists who will defend China's anti-Islamist policies in regards to the Uyghurs, right? And that's a complicated. And I know there's going to people call me cowards on both sides. But that's actually a very complicated thing that I don't feel super comfortable making broad pronouncements about. I do think China went a little too far, but I also understand some of the concerns that the Chinese government had about like Islamism and refusing modernization, etc. What I find funny though is some of these people have picked up Dugin as talking points, and yet Dugin's other major outreach group, other than like disaffected Marxist-Leninist and Christian rightist, is Islamist. And that's, you've spoken about this at length on your show about a year ago. You did a whole episode on this, but can you go into that? Because that's something I knew about, but you know more about than me.
Well, I guess the episode you're talking about is I have a friend. He lives in Australia. His name is Wahid Azal, and Wahid lived in Berlin with his wife and child, and he and his wife were activists, and mostly through ecological justice in the time at post 9/11. So there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe, and so he was a particular target, and was. So there were some people that came around Browning the Red that were using Marxist language, trying to infiltrate his group. But his wife, being German, was familiar with this sort of technique, as he says that that's just kind of a thing that they know about this in Germany, Browning the Red. And what Wahid claims, and I believe him, and this is what we spoke about on his podcast, on that episode, was that he believes the Duginists in Berlin poisoned his wife and is responsible for her death, and that's why he lives in Australia. So, he brought it to my attention that there's entryways through Islamism or Islam faith and stuff, and so that's pretty much the extent of what I know about that. But I would say that I think a lot of the same kind of rules apply, like disaffected Marxists that turn to third worldism or turn to anti-United States sentiment and become a bit frustrated and start looking for, sort of advancements on Marxist thought. And it's maybe it has to do with, like, I don't know, some kind of like loyalty to historical materialism and looking around at the conditions that you're in and saying, like, well, Marxism says use the conditions that are around me to build whatever is there. And so they end up grafting these ideas from Dugin onto stuff, and they lead them into these strange ideological perspectives. But yeah, like, from what I've understood, Duginism and it has their entryways through the online left, mostly through anti-imperialism. There is some stuff through that Wahid has brought to light and shown to me, and but that's about what I know about Dugin coming through Islam, or entryways through there. But yeah, it's an ecumenical jihad, man. I mean, it's wild that he can. And there are clips of him talking about how it's difficult, or he finds it difficult to bring these sort of disparate parts of the political spectrum together. But he's also a guy who has said that Francis Fukuyama was wrong and that Samuel Huntington was right, and that the next wars will be wars over ideology. And so I can see how, he's got a point. I can give him credit to say that he's got a point, that there is like an ideological sort of first principle, just enmity between, the particulars and universalism. And so I'm kind of losing my train of thought on that. But I would say, yeah, it's there's entryways through anti-imperialism, through all that stuff, man. And the methods of recruitment to the online left. I think we even see this in kind of some of the bots through like Haas and these people that were affiliated around, that whole group of people. I mean, you look at it now with, like, I think Jackson Hinkle just had like a New York Times fucking piece on him, man, which is like, how do you get that if you're not like a Fed sort of thing? Like the people around that we've noticed, that we've said, that we thought it was maybe feeding into it and making the problem worse by speaking about it. I mean, I think we were accurate with all that stuff. It's just kind of wild that all this, at least now we can talk about it openly, and it doesn't seem like it's feeding the issue or the problem as much as it was in years past.
Oh yeah, no, from 2015 to 2020, I basically didn't talk about Dugin. And whenever I did talk about Dugin, I had people yelling at me that I was like missing the wrong enemy or whatever. Now, admittedly, one of the people yelling at me is one of the people I know from when I was a conservative. So, who's also rediscovered leftism and the Jimmy Dore vein. I'm not sure that I believe this person's actually a leftist, but nonetheless, I mean, and I had expatriate expatriates from Russia who came back during the Russia-Ukraine war. A lot of Americans I knew who were living in Russia have left. A few have stayed. They're married to someone, and they're away from Moscow or whatever. And I have Russian fans and audience to this day. I mean, not a ton, but I do have them. And one of the things I wanted to, what I've seen is that the Russian and the Russian expats always tell me that Dugin's a joke. But people in Europe and in the Middle East tend to take Dugin more seriously, which leads me to believe that in some ways Dugin knows his project isn't for Russians. It's for people outside of Russia to create a space for Russian movement. Like Eurasianism and the talking points around Eurasianism all over. Like you hear that all over Putin. When people are like, oh, that maybe Dugin's having an influence on Putin. I'm like, no, Eurasianists are having an influence on both of them. And that's what that is. Maybe, I'm sure Putin knows who Dugin is, but and the multipolar stuff that's really come out, and that's even come out in certain parts of China, but I think, for me, the reason why we can talk about this is now back on the table. And what's also happened is as far as the left is concerned, and now to talk specifically about why this may be appealing to the left, um, white nationalism is never going to be a broad-based movement in the United States, even amongst white people. If white nationalism is one of those things that in the United States works when no one is aware that that's what they're doing, like explicit white nationalism is calls too much attention to itself. Like white supremacy likes to be quieter than that. So people who, but the other thing is, it's not really a demographically viable project. And even Sam Francis, the kind of one of the forerunners of what we might call the alt-right, admitted that in his book Leviathan and Its Enemies, that like white nationalism was a non-starter in the United States. Even in the 1990s, you could see that demographically, like middle-class white people were not going to be a big enough, even expanding the categories and whatnot to actually ever be completely and totally in charge, completely on their own and exclude everybody else. That was a weird fascist pipe dream. Francis actually kind of argued that you needed a coalition of people against the center who spoke out against resentment politics. And that's the funny thing about the Nietzsche part of this. I think Tut's right about the reactionary nature of Nietzsche, but I've always found it funny that what these people pick up on is the resentment part. And I told Tut this, like, the funny thing about right-wing Nietzscheans is they're some of the most resentful people you'll ever meet. So like that's that part of Nietzsche didn't come.
Yeah.
And so this resentment against the center, which this isn't just Dugin. You could read Paul Gottfried in the 90s. He was trying to do this. And Gottfried, Gottfried is another one of these people who comes out of, I don't think he was ever leftist, but Gottfried was a student of Marcuse. He was. So, and he encouraged, for example, Richard Spencer, when Richard Spencer was doing his graduate studies, to write on Adorno. So they came out of this. Greca, which is sort of a precursor to fourth positionism. That's the European you right around de Benoit and Guillaume Fay, who's dead now, and split with de Benoit. But these sort of like radical traditionalist people who also get published by Arctos Press most of the time. They also have been really hitting at this left-right coalition thing for much longer. And they, at one point, took over Chelios magazine, the magazine of the successors to the Frankfurt School. Like they had a whole issue dedicated to like left-right togetherness, in the 1990s. None of this is new. What makes it more effective now, all right, is that one, I think the Russia-Ukraine war, and I don't know how you feel about the Popular Front. I know amongst Marxist-Leninists that this is the Popular Front part of Marxist-Leninism is like divisive even amongst them. But I do think this is also an effect of a Popular Front to get Bernie elected that liquidated into Bidenism, because a lot of us came to this against, to Marxist politics by being betrayed by a similar coalition with Obama a decade ago. Like, so that happening again when the people who literally started their political career critiquing the Obama movement, people forget this in some ways, but like the dirtbag left, which is already a term that seems remarkably dated, was itself a critique of centrist Democrats, but in a very real way, it's been pretty much obvious to everybody, something that I've been afraid of since about 2016, since Trump started, was that our fear of the right would lead us to empower the center without realizing it, thinking we were empowering the left. That would make other kinds of right-wing thought more effective because they looked more counter-systemic. And thus now Dugin has all these things going for it. Now, if you actually read The Foundations of Geopolitics, Putin versus Putin,
Mm-hmm.
the fourth political position, you will see insane shit in there. And also the stuff that, people will say, oh, that's a liberal conspiracy theory, it's stated outright.
It's there. It's there.
It's not
Yeah.
even hidden. It's not in code.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Some of the fascist and post-fascist stuff is in code. That stuff isn't.
Yeah.
Like, the whole, like, we can use Marxism as a Sorelian myth to help us establish a theocracy. That's it. That's not hidden. That's explicitly stated. And I think, weirdly, social democratic Marxists and whatnot being unable to establish an identity that's truly separate from the Democrats is part of what makes that appealing. And then what do people do? Well, to try to establish something separate from the Democrats, they tail right instead of independent. Like, you start getting the stuff like you talked about, like, oh, I don't care about abortion. A Stalin banned abortion. We're not going to talk about how bad that failed and how quickly they undid it.
Mm-hmm.
But Stalin banned abortion. Stalin did stuff to, the Marxist-Leninist parties in the 40s and 50s all took what modern people would consider reactionary stances towards queer people and in non-standard relationships, ignoring that was a reversal of historical positions prior. And because in 1917, literally the most liberal marriage laws the world had ever known was in the USSR, including decriminalization of homosexuality, which was unheard of even in the United States. We didn't get, people forget that. We didn't get that. Kids, when I was a kid, homosexuality was still illegal in 20 states.
Yeah.
Like, just to remind you, I'm from Georgia, you're from Texas. Your state, I'm pointing the wrong way. Your state, Jules, is the state that went so far in their anti-gay laws that actually got the anti-gay laws thrown out off of right to privacy.
Well, this is like part of what I think is like part of the magnetism of Dugin is constituent is like, so like it's not just a political pull, man. It's like take someone who's apolitical who like sees a sort of fracturing of the family unit and takes like kind of a, I don't know, like a defensive stance against blurring the lines of gender or alternative, family unit arrangements, right? Someone like Dugin has something for that person too. I mean, if you've heard Dugin talk about anti-feminism and the way that he frames it as something inherently anti-human, as in like gender studies wishing to dissolve the final difference between men and women and impose an even more broad universalism of human beings. And so he frames all of this as anti-human. And if you give a guy that's like already reactionary time to listen to Dugin talk about trans people being anti-human, trying to dissolve the differences between us, Dugin's got something for that guy too. So it's not just like the political people that he's pulling in, I mean, in some ways, that same guy we're talking about that could be taking the defensive stance against trans people in the family unit, maybe someone that is a Christian that feels like maybe he's an evangelical or something, right? So like the Christo-fascist movement in this country is not like, when I looked at January 6th, man, I looked around, I didn't see anybody with like a political grievance. It was all like cultural sort of resentment grievances of like sort of an erosion of perceived privilege or something that caused these people to be in an uproar at the Capitol. And the great sort of question to me was like, how do you take non-political things like spirituality and turn that into a political forward issue? And so for someone who we're talking about, like someone who's taking this defensive stance, who's just like maybe just a bigot, right? Like there is something appealing within the movement of Christo-fascism to restore some sort of, I don't know, traditional, more, to that infringes upon the visibility of, LGBT communities, trans people, that brings things back to the 50s, so to say, like Dugin has something for those guys too. And so I when I listen to Dugin speak, you talk about these conservatives casting a wide net. I mean, Dugin's net is really wide to me with who he can pick up, and we've talked about several avenues of this today. But I'll tell you that, like, one of the big red flags with me, man, was like I was reading about Dugin, and I had read Teitelbaum's book, and I wasn't at the stage where I wanted to speak publicly about this stuff, but I picked up Ronald Biener's book, Dangerous Minds, and I read that, and then I interviewed him. And during the course of this interview, I just in real time discovered, like, I was like, oh shit, this Ronald Biener was on, he was one of the professors that was on the dissertation panel for Michael Millerman. And when I discovered that, suddenly Michael Millerman was like following my posts on Twitter and listening to my podcast. And, I'm sure you were already familiar with what it's like to have a podcast where it's audited by the right, but I wasn't familiar with that at the time. I was like, that's a big red flag for me, So
Yeah, I had mistaken for a long time. I was the popular, well, I'm not that popular, but I was the JJ the J Cal of Velvet Underground of left wing podcasters. But one of my dubious claims to fame before 2019 was that right wingers tended to like me because I would call out liberal bullshit, and this was even more true back in the early aughts when I did this blog called "The Disloyal Opposition to Modernity," which was which I just would I would go and interview like pagans and weird spiritual people and leftists of various types, and so I garnered an audience of, frankly, a mixture of very smart people and reactionary weirdos. And I've also seen a lot of leftists turn or semi-heel turn. Mark Fisher's turn to social democracy from whatever the fuck that weird autonomous left stuff he was in the aughts in the 90s. Well, he actually threw some people into an even further right orbit, and I knew them. And some of them were the people who literally helped me commission the original Vampire Castle essay. So I was aware that this was a possibility. We'd seen it a lot, and I attract, as a scholar of Christopher Lasch, scholar here being autodidactic, but still as a person who has, I remember Amy Therese, for example, before she went full bore right wing reactionary, citing influences and me going, she stole my reading list, because it was like Daniel Bell, Christopher Lasch, Bordegun, and Panacook. And I'm like, one, I don't believe you really read that. And two, like, who else knows both left communism and like conservatism? That's me. She's never once, Therese never fought me. She does not, as far as I know who I am. She did know who Doug Lane was and fought him. So I suppose that maybe that came through there. But nonetheless, I've seen this before, and I've had these people around. Like, I had to block Mark Shabota from my Facebook. So
did he do the original translations of 4PT as well?
Yes, he did. He did the OG one before Milliman cleaned it up. And he one time offered me to write for Attack the System, Keith Preston's blog, with some nebulous exchange of favors and access that was never defined, to translate some of Dugin's stuff that was anti-imperial, and I refused to. But I also remember being being confused because I knew Dugin from his prior National Bolshevik shit, that like, if I didn't know what he actually believed, that I would have been convinced by those articles too. Like, if I didn't know who American Fourth Position was and all this stuff, I would have been convinced by this. My inoculate, my kind of vaccine against this, to use an unfortunate metaphor these days, was the fact that I was a rightist first. And so I recognized all the moves. I recognized the tradition. I knew the history. I mean, the people you talked about. I mean, we talk about a more famous one. Fucking Whittaker Chambers was a communist at one point. You know, I mean, I could go through Arthur Koestler. You know, I could go through the whole communist to anti-communist during the 20s and 30s, both to the liberal centrist version, Koestler, Popper, etc., and the more you know, the more conservative version, Chambers, and then like the reactionary version, of which there is a ton. And Dugin seems to have specially created an ideology, and maybe it would help if I understood the context of like what he's trying to get to happen off of what's going on in Russia, because that's still, I will admit that even having friends in Russia and having a fair, like for an American, a good sense of Russian history, I do not actually understand what's going on the ground in Russia. Like I don't really know. It's hard for, and whenever I hear people trying to play modern criminologist, I'm like, you don't know, I don't know, no one knows.
Yeah.
Like, from where I can tell from talking to Russians, most Russians don't know. Like, it's not clear where this stuff is all coming from. And my fear when I first, you know, other than I didn't want to make this more popular, because it wasn't the only time. I mean, you know, a lot of people love Alex Coburn. But Coburn got soft on this shit towards the end of his life. You can see this in what Counterpunch has kind of overcorrected and become like kind of too pro NATO and stuff now. But like, you can see this in the stuff they were publishing when they were publishing Samir Amin and people who were like explicitly Russian ops, like who were like trying to bring back Pol Pot defense, which has now come back anyway. But that was the thing that they were running on Counterpunch in the early aughts, right before Coburn died. And Coburn was also, you know, talking about American fascism, but like talking about how maybe Marine Le Pen wasn't so bad. And that kind of stuff, when Coburn died, was whitewashed out of his late life. It was just, no one talked about it because everybody was like, a lot of people, including people like friend of the show and fellow Texan David Griscom, you know, they got their introduction to left-wing politics was like Coburn to Michael Brooks. I mean, you know, that was their pathway. And for me to go like, well, you know, Coburn was amazingly on in a lot of ways. I mean, he was good at calling Bernie out back in the day for Bernie's, you know, even before his presidential runs, for his like milquetoast stances on foreign policy and shit like that. I don't want to like erase Coburn's virtues, but he was soft on this shit. Explicitly. I mean, Paul Craig Roberts and a bunch of paleo conservatives worked for him at certain points, and also worked for RT and stuff like that. And when liberals started picking up this anti-Russian stuff in 2015, 2016, I dropped it all because I didn't want to contribute to Russiagate bullshit. Like,
yeah.
I mean, and that put me in a very weird position, because on one hand, I'm like, this isn't nothing. And on the other hand, these liberals are fucking exaggerating the threat, making it seem like there's like these Russian professors secretly controlling everybody. And I don't think Dugin has that kind of influence, but I also think of the people who try to convince me they has none are just wrong. Like, he seems to be, frankly, I think his aim is outside of Russia. I think his aim is at us.
He says as much. As he says that Russia should be the staging ground of an anti-United States revolution and you know, foundations of geopolitics. So ultimately I feel like his goal is the destruction of modernity being the United States Western sort of, you know, in the way that he disputes that Western culture even has like a metaphysics, that they've, you know, he says that they've based their entire sort of outlook on materialism, you know, like that it's a poverty-stricken sort of ideology. And you can see some of this sort of, you know, I think there's a kernel to be kind of pulled at in the way that he, well, I don't know that Dugin himself has like criticisms of Catholicism, but I know traditionalists in general don't think as highly of Catholicism as like they do of like Sufi Islam or Hinduism.
Yeah, let's say traditionalists tend to. I mean, if you look at Rene Guion, and Rene Guion is like a Volo without the politics. Like, That form of
Right.
traditionalism was quietist. It was like, okay, we're out. We might be reactionary as fuck, but we're reactionary without politics. We're just gonna like do
Yeah.
our spiritual shit. And you know what? I'm gonna say something. Maybe as a Marxist, I don't fuck with those guys. Like I just leave them alone.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like you want to be your Ron Dreyer, head out into the desert. My kind of Marxist answer is just like fucking let them.
Yeah.
But that's yeah, I kind of unpopular for being like, if they want to do that, then they're just out of our hair and we're both happy.
Yeah.
We don't have to impose our way of life on them. But it's interesting that you say that Dugin says that Fukuyama is wrong, because I think he's right that ideology keeps on rearing its ugly head. But the part of Fukuyama that I think haunts Fukuyama, not just us, is him saying that liberalism has become just the freedom of atomized individualism. And while this has some good effects and has universal appeal because everyone can see themselves as an atomized individual in some sense, it doesn't actually, like, people forget about the end of history and the last man part of that title. It's like basically he thinks that, like, this is actually kind of bad, that this is a future without vision, etc. And one of the things I find interesting about that is basically Dugin's critique of liberalism is Fukuyama, is that liberalism lost all of its other virtues because it's universalistic. It's inherently racist, which, okay, actually, and so depending on how you interpret universalism, somewhat true. Although, like I said, Dugin's definition of racism is wild. It is any idea that sets itself up that as a cultural bias without scientific proof or something is racist. So like any judgment of any other culture at all that is not and actually, since he doesn't really believe in science, that scientific caveat's also kind of funny that he puts it in there because he can't believe it.
Yeah, he's talked about how he doesn't see a doctor, and he like believes in like if like your eye gets sick, then stab out your eye kind of stuff. And he doesn't believe in science, but he is full of contradictions, as you know.
Yeah, I mean he's an irrationalist. I mean, the other thing about him is he's a Christo-fascist who's anti-satanic supposedly, who also was a satano-fascist at a different point of his life, and that weird occult traditionalist stuff that is not orthodox at all is also run through. Like an Orthodox Christian trying to do something with Ebola, that's
Right.
wild. Like,
yeah.
I mean, it is not that we haven't seen such contradiction before. How many Christians we know who are all in the Nietzsche, which is also itself like, dude hated you. like, dude thinks that Nietzsche's problem with the left is that it was too Christian.
Right.
Like,
incredible, man.
Like, for the American examples back in our youth, you and I are about the same age. I'm a little older than you, I think, but
I'm 40.
Yeah. So Ayn Rand and the amount of Christians that loved her, which was always like baffling to me too. I'm like, have you read any of the objectivist?
Have you read this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, it's elitism for idiots, but it's also explicitly anti-religious. So.
Well, it's like LaVeyanism is just Ayn Rand with candles, sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that he ran in these sort of occult circles when he was younger, and now, I mean, it just seems like it's one more instance of like being on one end of the spectrum and coming all the way to the other side. At one point he was supportive of the Communist Party after he was like very he was speaking out against like Soviet sort of control of society and stuff in his younger rebellious ages. But I think his father was some sort of like, there's some speculation in Charles Clover's book that his father was some sort of important guy in the Soviet government, and so Dugin was allowed to be rambunctious and do crazy shit, and his dad would get him out of trouble. So it just speaks to what you were talking about, how like some of the reactionaries that are the leaders in the reactionary movements are petty bourgeois stuff, you know. It's that he ran in these satanic circles when he was younger. I don't even know what to make of that, like at this stage now, and how it's relevant, other than just adding to the overall weirdness of and maybe lending some, like, the syncretism of all of this shit is what is wild to me too. Like,
how are you anti-universalist and a Christian? Just, I mean, just right there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and I mean, how are you anti-West if you're a Christian when like purportedly Western values are in line with Christianity as well? Like, I mean, it's so, yeah. There's amazing sort of contradictions within this shit. But I think and I question now, like, how much relevance Dugin has at this point. Like, the last thing I've heard about Dugin was the incident with the car bomb, and then there was a state funeral for his daughter, and there were a lot of what I understand to be like Russian, political agents there at the funeral. So
yeah, there seems to have been. I just saw someone show me an article from Russia that there's like a university in Russia courting him again, so he might go out of being like the intelligent Alex Jones wing of Russian media back into being some kind of foreign policy academic. But then again, I mean, like, do you make someone relevant by making them an academic? Tends to be no. So it's hard for me to say what his trajectory actually is. I also think, as far as like the Marxist Leninist world, we were talking about this where Duginisms come in. I think there's a lot of other right wing stuff coming in simultaneously, like the post left social democracy stuff. Most of those guys have just either depoliticized or gone conservative outright. A lot of the left populists have given up the left part of that. And I think, we in general, one thing I would say about Dugin is a particularly weird and fascinating form of this, and one that like you and I can go back and forth. And I go back and forth for myself about how, like, when I was asked to do this series and they said that, start with Dugin, and I was like, on one hand, it doesn't seem dangerous right now to talk about Dugin, and there are clearly, quote, left-wing factions like MAGA communism and people adjacent to it who have been influenced by it either directly. I mean, in the case of MAGA and patriotic social and the patriotic communist movement and all that, it was explicit very early.
Yeah.
But also LaRoucheism in there, the return of LaRoucheism, which is wild. I mean, that's wilder than
the Schiller Institute having like a candidate for Congress or something as well at one point. What the fuck? Yeah.
And like LaRouche Pack, the split between the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Pack is funny, but like LaRouche Pack going all in on the Stop the Steal stuff, it was just like, what in the world is going on?
What is happening? Yeah.
But in another sense, I think we have to just admit we are in a moment where the failures of the left in general have led people to turn to right-wing options, even people who don't think they're doing that. I mean, how many people have become standard bogfuck Democrats, which from me is a shift to the right.
Mm-hmm.
Like becoming a progressive from a socialist, it's a movement to the right. Like, and it might be a concession to reality. It might be you finally got your boomer parents' money. I don't know. But nonetheless, we've seen a lot of this shit lately. I mean, we've seen a ton of it. I thought that when the other thing was happening concurrent to this like weird boom of Duginism like a year or 2 years ago was also all the social democrats jumping on the Biden train at the moment that it seemed to me that it was about to crash. Like, you just seeing all these people talk about like Biden, the most progressive president since FDR, but we mean it as a as a critique of the other presidents. I'm like, well, motherfuckers, when he wasn't more progressive than Lyndon Johnson, which, you know, Lyndon Johnson was a warmonger and a shit storer, but he actually did believe in helping the fucking poor. And two, this is a right-wing concessionism. It is, you know, it's just not as far to the right as something like Dugin or you know, the all against the center mentality. Another thing, though, I think what we have to deal with is like that ecumenical jihad and popular frontism. They're very similar.
Very similar. Yeah.
They're very similar. And as I always point out about the problem with popular frontism, even in national liberation movement, is it will immediately descend into a civil war. Immediately.
Yeah. Right? Well, populism is also like largely gathered around a floating signifier that'll disappear or just become something else instantly. You know, we saw this with kind of, I mean, not that the trucker convoy was any sort of popular front, but we saw how the signifier just sort of disappeared and that whole thing just sort of dissolved because there were a bunch of people there without like material grievances, man. It was like based out of something, the vaccine and liberty and these ideas and not anything that was like going to withstand just the standard sort of vaporizing of a floating signifier, man. It wasn't a strong enough sort of conjoining issue and movement, and
it's an extremely temporary movement. Not that I support, like, I know I had some leftist friends who supported the Trudeau administration's actions on it. I kind of didn't. I was like, it's not really that much of a threat. It's just annoying. Yeah. My feeling about that is one of the things that you've had, and this is, I don't know, you've gotten into left politics since 2015. I've been in left politics since 2008.
Yeah.
But you and I both can kind of see that, like, there's also these weird tailless moments where left wingers like, okay, we got to jump on the trucker convoy. I mean, like, because that's a working class thing, and I'm like, well,
it's a failure. It's a failure distinction of who is actually working class. You know, it's like how are you just like so visually impaired that you can't see your fellow workers here, and you mistake these petty bourgeois people that own their trucking rigs that are distinct from like the operators that don't own their stuff, and we see this several times, including these weird sort of like this sort of, I don't know, man, how like suddenly everyone who took this shift to the right hates people to work at Starbucks, like hates people to make your coffee, and are intent on making them not part of the working class.
Yeah, because they pretend that they're like somehow that they're blue hair PMC because they're cultural affectations.
Yeah, dude. It's I mean, so it's wild, some of the ideas that we see spawn out of this stuff.
I mean, that was I think the discourse this was a year ago where like Korean business owners proletariat, but blue-haired Starbucks baristas not proletariat. I used to call it Barista Gate.
Like, yeah.
Like it was just, I'm like, come on. And the person's like, well, productivism. I'm like, one, I want you to go back to your theories of surplus value, because Marx actually does not make being part of the proletariat dependent solely on being productive. Productivity is productivity towards capital, not towards social value anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But two,
that's a great point, by the way. Yeah.
But two, beyond that, even if you assume that, I mean, you're acting like these petite bourgeois are the industrial proletariat, which they're not. Also, the industrial proletariat, as you classically understand it, as in like workers in factories, is all of like 13% of the population at this point, and declining. So because of automation, good fucking luck trying to run a revolution with that.
Yeah, some of these dumbasses were like, well, let's go after the bricklayers. They're the people that, I'm like, what? Go after the bricklayers?
How many bricklayers are left?
What are we talking about? Yeah, like yeah. So
I mean, for one, a lot of these people are contractors, and like, look, like, I actually do think Marxists need a better answer to how to handle the petite bourgeois than fuck them. But you know, like, because in the sense that even Marx admitted early on, artisans in the very small end of petite bourgeoisie do culturally and productively overlap with the proletariat. Where they are different is that their incentives are different because they're not wage earners. And with the trucker stuff, I actually even I talked to someone about it. I'm like, look, like if you're a trucker, some of these restrictions on movement or whatever hamper you, and you're actually, since you're a solo employee in a fucking truck, you're actually not that at risk for COVID, but you are a transmission vector. So like you feel, and it
Yeah.
sucks. But I pointed out to people before, like if you think truckers are the manifestation of the working class, I hate to tell you, but trucker strikes have been historically used against other workers by right wingers since the 1960s in Chile and the 70s in the United States. Like the trucker convoy, that wasn't even the first one. Like, does that mean that truckers don't deserve representation? No, I mean they do, and some of them are proletariat, some of them are, not all of them own their rigs, but nonetheless, you're taking a tiny portion of the working class and extrapolating all the interest of the entire working class based off of a part of it that has radically different incentives than everything else. And you see this stuff everywhere with this popular movement. I keep on emphasizing, like, look, I do think at one point popularism was progressive in the sense that it helped us towards socialism in the 19th century, because you had all these agrarian workers that were not quite peasants and not quite agrarian wage earners yet. They were basically sharecroppers and the children of sharecroppers, and they needed a movement, and that movement was aligned with the workers in the 19th century. Absolutely. You don't live in the 19th century, motherfucker. Like, that's not true. It's actually similarly to me yelling at people of like about like peasants wars in North America, and I'm like, Maoist stance on peasantry has no place here. We don't have fucking peasants. So like,
Well, I think a lot of this, man, like a lot of this boils down to an inadequate worldview by the left. Like, when I say worldview, like it's like we, at least in the West, it was like for a while, it was like, what are we fighting for? Communism is not free college, y'all. Like this seems to be the apotheosis of where our vision is leading us. Is like
free college and healthcare, and
free college, healthcare, and then we sit on that for a while. And
what every other major capitalist power in the developed world got, except for us.
Yeah. So it's like we're, so if we can just maybe get to worker consciousness, and maybe we can get to broader social welfare. But like, yeah, so like, but also that limited scope of vision also has to do with the way that this country does not have a labor party. And so I feel like all of us within this political spectrum engaging in politics in the United States are somewhat disoriented in the way that we do not have a labor party that represents us, and labor is relegated to a small faction of the progressives or something within the Democratic Party that will never have the power that it purports to have at times. Or
weirdly, right wingers like Michael, I mean, he's a center rightist, but Michael Lind is actually more accurate in describing the class dynamics of what made up the Democratic Party and its concessions to labor. It was like, well, it was Sunbelt industrialist, like small business petty bourgeois and workers who work for them, and then the broad, the workers of the broad industrial movements as opposed to finance capital or whatever. And Lynn's like, and the interesting thing is, basically in the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, that coalition's reversed. But you know what I pointed out? I'm like, none of them are actually workers' coalitions. Workers are caught up in them. And even in Lynn's model, Lind and Turchin and all those people see the working class as essentially a static thing that will glom on to different elites, but has none of its own agency and interest. So if you look at the Lind model of class conflict in the new class war, he basically sees this as an inter-elite division with the overclass, which he doesn't say who it is. I think he means bourgeoisie, but he's not going to give Marxists that much credit. Are letting the petit bourgeois and the professionals fight, right? And the working class sides with one or the other, depending on their interests. That is kind of how things work right now. But the thing is, like, that model is based off the idea that the working class do not ever manifest in their own interests. Their own interests are actually just manifest in whatever their local bourgeoisie wants, because that's going to keep their jobs. And I'm like, well, that's the poverty of not having a Marxist view of classes being able to have their own agency. And weirdly, you're focusing on the classes that that they can't have their own agency, which is why they're politically dependent. That's the petit bourgeois and the professionals. I mean, and I'll also say I'm not a PMC theorist. I actually think a good portion of professionals are labor aristocratic proles, to be frank. But nonetheless, by that I mean they're wage earners in credentialed fields, but they're wage earners. And in fact, one of the Christian Parenti of all people, writing about the PMC, actually pointed out that one of the interesting things in the 20th century is that the professional managerial class went from being petit bourgeois to being actually proletarianized in a lot of ways. It's elite proletarianized. It has a lot of elite patronage and so higher wages and shit, but it's now dependent on the wage fund. It is no longer like directly getting its own profits.
Right.
And that's missed in a lot of these discussions. Eric Olin Wright, not one of my favorite Marxists, but he actually did point out the reason why a lot of workers hate their manager more than their owner of the business is the person who dominates you is a closer proximity to you than the person who exploits you, which is largely hidden. And a lot of these right wingers know how to zero in on the domination thing to hide the exploitation thing. So they get you mad at the manager, so you forget the manager works for a goddamn owner, or for structural capital if it's a publicly traded firm.
Yeah.
You know, like that. To play the middleman to hide the actual ruler is one of the oldest fucking internal in the book.
Right.
And right wingers know this shit. And I think Dugin knows it too. Like, everyone fucking hates the American empire. Like, you know, like even most Americans at this point hate the American empire. Let's be honest. Like we don't even like it anymore. I mean, like, you know, I remember saying someone for supposedly be proletarian in a country that got sold out. It is weird to me that, you know, we sold out the entire world, and yet somehow we don't even have the basic shit that Europeans and fucking East Asians do in capitalism. I feel like we got screwed over a labor aristocracy somehow. You know, like I get really passionate about this because just it's like we're the core that doesn't even get shit.
Well, you know, like, this is like when I go back and look at like Marcuse, I'm like, I can understand why this guy started looking for alternative subjects, right? For like looking for, I mean, why people were like, hey, maybe the historical subject is the student. You know, the frustration that led to Marcuse sort of like, you know, looking for alternative subjects. I mean, I'm a fan of this thought process of like Heideggerian Marxism, that like the working class must discover that it is the historical subject and achieve its own Dasein of seizing means of control. Like I'm a fan of what Marcuse did there, you know, and attributing an agency towards the working classes. I mean, to think of the masses of people as not having agency is like a hugely flawed sort of analysis that, like, I don't know, what are you, just ignoring history? Like, all of modern society is founded on the beheading of a tyrant. This is what happens when the masses are ignored. And so, you know, I think that, like, you know, there's a lot there within Duginism for anyone that feels a sort of Nietzschean resentment, you know, and that resentment is kind of easy to stumble across in whoever you are in whatever society. You know, if you hate the U.S. empire, if you're an anti-feminist, if you are an anti-imperialist that's following a Marxist line, this shit is sticky, you know. And you said yourself, you had like an inoculation to it through formerly being a right winger, so you recognize these sort of rhetorical patterns that are common sort of moves that they make, you know. But there's also the concept that, like, I mean, if we talk about the flip side of this too, like Foundations of Geopolitics was published around the same time as the Grand Chessboard, you know, and these are not things that like we're saying only Russia does. Just we have our own sort of Foundations of Geopolitics that Brzezinski wrote, you know, and we have our own plan for
Brzezinski, Huntington is a Foundations of Geopolitics.
Yeah.
I mean, we have our own evil overlords. We have our own oligarchs. I mean, this is one of the things that I have been very much like, let's not just talk about our Russian oligarchs. Let's talk about our tech oligarchs here because they are
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah. I mean, I'm with you on this in the whole techno feudalism concept, and the money is in the hand of a few tech overlords, and the rest of us are just sort of within their dominion here. And that makes total sense to me, and it makes sense in terms of a Marxist framework of like having a kernel of feudalism contained within capitalism or late capitalism, whatever you want to call it. That all makes sense to me, and it's one more subject that one could be resentful about as well, and so maybe if you're a deep cat and you read Dugin and you kind of latch onto his philosophical frameworks here, I mean, he would tell you that like modernity is nothing more than like the the death of God and rendering the individual subject as the sole arbiter of the good. And within this sort of untethered framework, it's like being free in a vacuum. It's like you can go anywhere, but there's nowhere to go and there's nothing to see. And he longs for this sort of like anchor, which is somewhat of like a caste system of a role within. Like if you are a merchant, then that is your role, and life is fulfilling based upon the fulfillment of your role. And so, but this is the argument from traditionalists that the golden age of truth, beauty, and insight that is best for human beings and society was at an earlier stage where we were all born into the roles to be played. And so
But
I
you
just,
notice the traditionalists usually fetish the aristocrats and not the peasants, even though they might say, "Oh, it's better for the peasants too." But like,
yeah,
and like, yeah, I mean, yeah, the working day was better for some peasants, but also being randomly raped by a lord or just killed by a knight who didn't get sent off to crusade because he had nothing better to do that day is not something you want to be subject to. Now, one, I will admit there's a tendency in modernity to make the past worse than it probably was. I mean, the past is pretty bad. Don't get me wrong, but
sure.
like, there's this tendency to make it sound like it was like all bad. Then modernity happened and everything was great. The Steven Pinker worldview. Whereas I definitely think like whether or not I'm still a classical Hegelian, or a Marxist Hegelian is a question even to me. But I do sort of think that like I think of progress in spirals, but um, uh, I think one of the interesting things to me about, say, elite socialism, um, and traditionalism is they both favor people who don't have to work, imagining how great it would be to be had unalienated labor, except that, you know, we're going to ignore the fact that it's based off of binding people not just to their position but to certain land and limiting who they can marry. And also they're basically all, I mean, serfs are all but slaves. They start as slaves. Um, and just romanticizing that's not that different to me than like these people in the South in the 1850s, the guy who invented the term sociology in English, actually, who were talking about how slavery was good anti-capitalism, which despite the fact that they were like doing internal to capitalism itself some of the most raw accumulation we've ever seen in the human history of the world. But that's how they romanticized their role in that, was that, oh, we are more like these traditional societies. You and I are Southerners. We know about the agrarians who, while they weren't mostly outright neo-Confederates, they had this hankering for like the agrarian diffuse life as the real life of the human being,
Right.
which ignores the fact that they needed tons of servants and mostly they were romanticizing a planter class of people who didn't fucking work. And I get it. Like I have lived in places in close proximity to peasants in like Central America, and you know what? I've told people I'd rather be poor in a peasant village than I would in a city in Mexico, hands down. But I'd rather not be poor. Like,
Sure.
either way, yes, they're like, Dugin is right. Some of these, let me rephrase that. Dugin is seizing on something that is correct, that certain pre-modern unalienated forms of community are somewhat resilient and do give you something psychologically to hang on to in tough times that modern people largely lack. Although we haven't lacked it all the time. There have been times where we had proxies for these things. The party, the even earlier times with church. What I find interesting today, and I'm not a Robert Putnam head. I don't. I think that there's something missing in the Bowling Alone picture other than just modernity. That there's some kind of relation of production and reproduction that we're not seeing in that picture, because there must have been something enabling these mass moves to happen in the past that, other than just technologies, why they don't happen now. I just can't believe that it's just Facebook.
Mhm.
But I do think we have to be honest that we had organizations that met a lot of these functions, and today even the religious ones don't seem to be able to do that. Um, and I've always been a person saying, like, look, I don't think we never do what religious organizations do. The left is not a church. But you know what? We could learn from church, but I'm also seeing churches are dying too. Like, religious affiliation today is like something that you meme about, just like your politics or anything else. Like, how many of these trad caps you see on, on in Dime Square posting all on Twitter now that Musk is in charge, uh, are actually going to church on the weekend? I imagine not a lot. Um, and the attendance rates would back that up. So, there's something hollowed out about this. Then I can see that appeal, right? You're right. It's definitely there. Dugan's going to speak to that. A lot of things will speak to that, honestly. I mean,
I think you might be talking about something that I've thought about. Sorry to interrupt.
go ahead.
Like this sort of like latent thirst for the spiritual, like
Mm-hmm.
this sort of weird like society seems to have something left for wanting, and I don't know if it's exactly a lack of community which sparks this. I don't know if it's a lack of meaning. I don't know if it's a general fatigue in like a Byung Chul Han sort of sense that like we've expelled the other through sameness. Um, but there is something profoundly sort of like a malnutrition of the soul kind of thing. And I don't want to get like into sort of speaking about like the ills of modernity or something in like a anti-modernist sort of perspective. But I mean, we see this in society to where like, and this is an argument that comes from some of the traditionalists that I've read. That's like that you can't eliminate the sacred; you can only transfer the sacred. And part of that I saw, which was remarkable, was in thinking about how on January 6th, when they described the Capitol as being desecrated, uh, desecrated is not a secular word. And it sort of brought up this civic religion sort of mindset. And I started to pay attention again to the sort of uh, the founding fathers mythology and the way they looked like the Athenian Greeks in their monuments, and the ways that documents are sacred, and the way that flags have burial rights, and it just so what you're getting at is like from this lack of third places, lack of community, this overly fatigue and exhaustion, sort of another Byung Chul Han thing, like the violence of positivity, that everything is saturated and exhausted. Um, like so it's hard for me to speak about this, but I think we know what we're talking about. There's like something there around there which has created what I've just referred to as like a latent thirst for the spiritual. Like people, like what do you get out of Bernie that you what do you get out of Trump that you don't get out of Bernie back in like 2016? Well, it's like Trump kind of, I mean, that seemed like a historical movement, and you get to be a part of a movement with that. So people are looking for like a restoration of this sort of role that I spoke about earlier, whereas like, you are the sole arbiter of the good, you are a containerized individual subject, and you can go anywhere and do anything, but there's nothing to do and there's nothing to see. But maybe within a political movement like Trump, you got to feel like you were a part of a moving portion of history. And so maybe that was in terms of fulfillment or meaningfulness for the for the average person who has a lack of these things in their life, maybe there was some fulfillment to that degree on that end. But yeah, I wonder if you anything out of that, if there's something there, because I've thought about this a lot, and I don't ever really do a good job of wording it. And I hope I've done a good job of describing what I'm trying to get at. Here the
Yeah,
last.
I always consider, so I'm gonna pick a fight with both Johan stands, but I've always seen both
Yeah,
Johanna as like vaguely hinting at something real, but not actually fleshing it out enough for me to actually use him.
I'm probably doing the
Um,
same thing there. Yeah, yeah. It's
yeah,
like, yeah,
but I want to pick up on something that I think is important. One,
sure.
for all of my methodological materialism, and I consider myself a methodological materialist, I am not actually a raw materialist in the the Feuerbachian sense of
Mhm.
the term. Like I don't think that I don't think that that's actually a very satisfying metaphysics, even from the standpoint of explaining the existence of being. So I tend to be very careful about how I word this, but there's a reason why Matt Christman, is one of the most popular leftists, despite the fact that a lot of what he says is both insightful and yet incoherent, and a more lefty way than Dugin, but he actually shares that, is because he talks like a fucking prophet. All right. Um, Now, I think the traditionalists get on us. They offer a melange, a strange view of incoherent spiritual paths, ideologies, and politics. I mean, the one thing I would say is my warning about this great ecumenical jihad is the moment jihad's over, the next person you fight is your comrade. It has to
Mm,
be necessarily.
mm,
Um, so there is that. But I do think until we speak to this need for a third thing, this need for a mediation, all right, that people have, even if it's a civic religion, all right, there's a reason why a lot of the civic rituals of the United States or of Russia or whatever, those symbols, those things, still matter to people, even when they don't even fucking believe in the country that instantiated them anymore, or they think it's so fallen that it's so fallen away that all these things are kind of hollowed out. And yet those things still have meaning. That to me, it's a blind spot of Marxism. I'm not saying that Marxist if we just incorporated spirituality, we'd have a perfect ideology. I don't know that's true. I tend to think the Marxists tend towards explaining things in material terms tends to actually be much more helpful. But we do have to look at the mediating power of these ideas and this idea of a third thing. I'm always at war with David Graeber, but David Graeber and Marshall Solomons in their book on kings talk about meta persons and like fake kings, and like so often in egalitarian societies there will be a projection of an unegalitarian figure that's not a person but acts like a person in your head. So you have like the great king in heaven or whatever, but they're far fucking way in heaven and we're equal here. And I think there is something to that mediation of these contradictory impulses in the human person that religion and spirituality get to. The problem that you have is that religion almost always requires class mediated power to be maintainable, which is why people tend to go for what I tend to think of as otherwise vibish garbage gook of spirituality. But because there is a kind of correct, that the average person has a correct view that like, well, religion's trying to get me subordinate to somebody a lot of the time. And while these doctrines may make sense or I might believe in them, I'm often part of this hierarchy that I don't really want to be a part of. So there's a class relationship here, and fuck that shit. Um, and a lot of people, even a lot of religious mystics, like grok this some way, like they feel this somewhere. Um, and so that tension's in religious thinking. Uh, I tend to think that we have to kind of get into the world of like, and it's funny because we're talking about a Russian and I'm going to go to other Russians, but like Bogdanov or Bakhtin are people who really thought about what would a proletarian or a post-class even more than proletarian, because remember, the goal of communism isn't just the victory of the proletariat, it's the abolition of class altogether. What would that look like if we're not making shit up? Like, what is God building, or whatever what does it mean to have an immanent metaphysics that also respects materialist reality? And I think that is a want for a third thing, the thing that mitigates and mediates. Marxists tend to distrust the third thing, rightly, because we see most people using it to fool us. The fetish, right? The fetish is the third thing, and it hides, but it also binds, and we know that too. And so when we're faced with Dugin, if we don't try to deal with the mediation, we're gonna fucking lose. Like, and I think we are. I mean, because like, I don't think we're losing to Duginism. I think we're losing to, I think we're losing to ourselves, actually. That like, in this kind of like
We
material.
don't even have enough power to lose to ourselves, bro.
Well, here's where I might disagree with you.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us on the left downplay our own power.
Sure.
Because it actually has really negative implications about what we did. The scarier thing to me is this idea, which I think is partly true. We never had enough power to take over society, but we had a lot more power than we thought. And you know what we did? We just gave it to the fucking Democrats. We just gave it to them.
Yeah.
Like, we didn't even ask for that much for it. Like we were just like, oh, Trump's scary. Please take scary man way. Like, and as much as I don't love giving Platypus Affiliated Society credit for much, I'll give them credit for this. They are right that in some ways the right, not just the Dugin right, the Trump right, even the fucking neoconservative right, understood the crises of post-neoliberalism better than us, because we still thought we were fighting neoliberalism and they'd already moved on. And if it kind of gets you that we're fighting like this, we're talking about this beast Dugin who seems so relevant now, but really all his major ideas are from 2005 to 2009. He hasn't really had a lot of new ideas since then. I mean, and even then, like we said, they weren't his ideas. He was just synthesizing them. But he hasn't done, like, I've read some of his later work, and it's not nearly as vital and innovative in the way it's synthesizing. So in a way, all this is just, the present and the past are catching up to each other. And it's because I think in this turning in that I mentioned early on with the left, in this turning into our national identities and whatever, not just in the United States, I think it happened in a lot of places, we really let the ball drop on a lot of stuff. And when we lost that stuff that we left the ball drop became obvious, because we also didn't get anything domestically. So then it became very clear what we lost, both by changing our focus and what we didn't achieve when we did. And that's, and people are going to take advantage of that. I mean, Dugin's one manifestation of it, but I think in American terms, we're going to see a lot of weird shit coming. I think this national conservatism, it seems to be slowing down right now, but it's slowing down because basically it might win the next election. Like, if you look at conservatism today, I was talking to someone about this. Rene Girard and all these, like, Girard wouldn't even thought of himself as a conservative, but another one of these weird iconoclastic thinkers from the middle of the 20th century. These were people that you read if you were on like the paleo conservative right, or if you were on the left. A kind of 90s post-structural left, right? Those people are now dominating conservative reading lists and stuff. If you look at how like the encyclopedia for who counts as a conservative has changed, you see more of those thinkers, more reactionary thinkers, and less neoliberals and less Milton Friedman. And like I said, I see Evola now listed on conservatism's page. That was never the case in the in a Wikipedia article in the aughts. That wouldn't have happened. So it tells you that there's been a shift in general, and I think Dugin is as much a symptom of it as a cause. That that mainline traditionalism still seems too weird for most American conservatives to take directly, but things that rhyme with it are things that are vulgarized versions of it, like the Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson index of the world. Tucker being the smart half of that, Jones being the idiot half of that, but nonetheless, that you're going to see a lot more of that, and they're going to go back to appealing to leftists. And we have to remember that Jones, for example, in the aughts and even in the late 90s, also tried to do this. Oh, the liberal left is terrible. They're all globalists, lizard people. I mean, he wasn't a lizard person, conspiracist, but you know what I mean. Um,
He did host that guy David.
yeah, yeah. They used to be enemies, and now they're all
Yeah,
in shit.
yeah. But that was
But
part of how I, my entryways into anti-capitalism were through Alex Jones and that entire milieu. I mean, I used to listen to a lot of Alex Jones, and before I was ever into left politics, I feel like I was probably just really conspiratorial. So, but it was through listening to like left media, left in the left ecosystem, and reading history and a bunch of Marxism stuff. It's that like eventually you figure out like, oh, wait a second, these guys are, there's several different ways to be like anti-capitalist, and not all of them lead to like, a moral position that one can live with. Not all of them, some of them are just anti-Semitic, trails that are more obvious than others, and all conspiracies at their base are some kind of anti-Semitism, and but I say all that because like, Alex Jones probably, I mean, I know a lot of leftists who are very familiar with Alex Jones. At one point, he didn't seem like he was harmful. He seemed like he was sort of like an Art Bell type of figure, where you listen to him, and whether you were listening about the Illuminati and lizard people or about space aliens, it was just like out of the realm of what was relevant, And then one day, like so many of us, we have an incident in our life where like we're, I don't know, sitting at a bar and somebody's discussing, the Illuminati and Jewish conspiracies or something, and it became a bigger problem than we anticipated. And in the same way, I think we can take those lessons and apply them towards Dugin and his ilk of like, these are things that on their surface seem incoherent and seem like bullshit and don't seem like they're going to be a problem, and seem like even if they do become a problem, they're not going to be a very large problem, but they're a problem. And we've seen this now with Dugin. So like when you offer how you were inoculated to this stuff, I was similarly through having gone through the Alex Jones channels and come out of that stuff. I picked up a lot of because at his core too, it's like, I mean, Dugin is profoundly anti-Semitic as much as he disavows racism and all of that stuff. I mean,
Jews are fine as long as they're in Israel.
Right.
Like
yeah, it's just a reification of strong borders, and
right.
yeah. So, go ahead. Yeah.
No. Well, it's interesting that we talk about the Jones world. I was never part of that world, but I will tell you what I was part of. In the 90s, I got scooped up in two things. One, I was in the zine world. I was a little like pro kid who fucked around with zines, and I actually ended up like homeless, fucking around with that stuff and not having a good job. I was homeless off and on a lot in my upper teens, but like really homeless, like street homeless, not McKinney-Vento living on people's houses homeless. And that turned me off on that weird gutter punk voluntary scene just because of what happened to me. And also, the one political excursion I did when I was 18 years old is we drove to the battles for Seattle. We'd heard about it in the zine stuff. We were Southern kids. We had no idea. We knew we didn't like Clinton, and we knew we didn't really like what's his face? Oh God, he's an ancient Republican who wrote it. Bob Dole. We knew we didn't like either one of those fuckers. And we knew that what the America was probably doing to the rest of the world was kind of bad. All right, so we drove up to the Battle for Yad and we saw this anarchist carnival-esque thing, and people declared that they won. I saw you didn't win shit. That was my inertial thought. You gaggle of Trotskyists and anarchists. And two, that Pat Buchanan guy who was there sounds the most serious. And then the other thing was I was involved in Rage Against the Machine forums on email at when I would go to the library at my high school. And you know, Rage Against the Machine was like Rage Against Everything. You know, you would read, like, if you go back, that book that was I mean, that picture of books on the back of the second Rage Against the Machine album, which was my introduction to leftist literature. Like, I read it's like the first time I encountered Christopher Lash. In retrospect, that was the most incoherent leftist reading list that's ever been made. But you know, like, it was there. I read it. It was interesting. I read a lot of stuff from that time. Angela Davis, I learned about Momia Abdul Jamal and all that stuff. Leon Peltier, all that stuff through that. One thing I will say though is we were also around the anti-Waco, not Might Bay,
Ruby Ridge
Ruby Ridge.
stuff.
And I still think when yeah, and I still think when leftists or liberals start like talking about the Clinton administration as if trying to justify what happened at Ruby Ridge, I still think that's fucked up. Like, I'm just like, nope, it's not defendable. But that got me in that world because I'm like, yeah, that's fucked up. Like, it's also fucked up what happened to these black people. It's also fucked up what happened to these indigenous people. But I mean, I don't, you know, that guy may have been a right nationalist, but his baby didn't deserve to get shot. So and that
it was a Fed that brought him in. It was a Fed that got him, that sold him a sawed-off shotgun or something like that.
He was entrapped.
Yeah, he was entrapped. Yeah.
And I've recently, you know, gone back and forth about what, you know, I've done a lot of studies of the Weavers and all this, and I'm still not sure that they were actually white nationalists. I don't know. Like, they were adjacent, but I don't know that they themselves were. But even if they were, it doesn't actually justify what the ADF did. But my point is that outrage got me listening to Pat Buchanan. That got me in that world. And then what really solidified this was I was dealing with the anti-Iraq war protests in 2001 and 2002. And during 2001, there was the protest at Sea Island. And we were going to protest because this was also the G8. Like, this was basically supposed to be the Alter Globalization Movement Part 2, and I dealt with the International Answer, and they seemed like a joke, and I dealt with people from antiwar.com and the Libertarian Party, and they didn't. And that's how I got sucked into that world. And so I knew a lot of people from Alex Jones' world, and I remember, like, Jones back then was very much doing we all need to fight the neocons, we'll get the left in if we have to, too, even though the left, like, he would also, like, if you really paid attention to what he was saying that the neocons were the real left, and, like, you know, it was pretty cynical, a la the way we talked about Dugin earlier. But if you were just superficially paying, it very much seemed like left and right against the fucking neoconservatives, center right. And I saw myself as on the right wing of that coalition until about 2005, when I realized, for a variety of reasons, like, you know how you tell yourself that there's one thing that's really like it's overdetermined, there's like 50 things.
Yeah.
But I started corresponding with people who would eventually be around Richard Spencer. I led to a letter that I shared with Richard after I left the right. I started, like, noticing this human biodiversity movement and all these weird racialists, and I just never could abide by racialists even while I was a right winger. And then I think Pat Buchanan wrote, like, this book that was like, you know, maybe we shouldn't have fought World War II, and maybe it would have been okay if the Nazis had killed off the communists, more or less, you know. And I was like, you know what, I'm out. Like, that was that way. And then I predicted the recession to come, and I was like, okay, Marxists have a better understanding of recession, so that's where I went. But it you know, it took me 4 years to, like, reorient. You know, I worked on the Mike Gravel campaign in Georgia. I then jumped over for the Obama campaign when Gravel lost. And the Obama campaign solidified me as a leftist because the moment he appointed his cabinet, I was like, fuck no. But for me, I say all this because I think that you and I come out of this world where we know this, but it helps that we're Southern. I mean, it
Yeah,
really does.
it
Like,
does. Yeah.
it helps that you and I think the thing about me is I do not, for the vast majority of my life until very recently, now that I live in a major city, I did not move amongst leftists and progressives in the majority of my life. I moved amongst depoliticized proles who didn't really have a
Hmm.
politics whatsoever, or right wingers. That's who was around.
Yeah.
Like, and so I know that world pretty intimately, and I know when someone's trying to sell it weird shit, and that world is full of weird shit. Like, that's another thing that people underestimate about the right. I remember in the aughts and the aught teens, it was like, oh, the right wing's so unified, they're so, and I'm like, have you ever been in like the South? It's not unified. There's tons of snake oil salesmen and grifters. It's madness out there. Um, for me, in some ways, Dugin is both a smart form of that, but from a different context, so we don't recognize it. Americans don't recognize it because it's Russian.
Mm.
Like if it was coming from an American professor or from a media figure a la Alex Jones, we would have more immunities to it. And I think that's something we have to like think about. Another thing I think a lot of about, maybe this will be my last thought and I'll hand it over to you, is like a lot of America's most effective reactionaries are not American.
Mm.
Like who's the reactionary thought leaders? They're usually from fucking Canada or something. Like it's and that's because they speak in a way that doesn't trigger a lot of our immediate responses to like our uncle who's a reactionary shitbag or whatever. Like we don't have the immune responses for it.
I mean,
What do you think?
I think it is helpful being a Southerner. I've always really aspired to be a good Southern Marxist. You know, a guy that has a little like little fireplace going on with a worn out copy of like What Is to Be Done and sawed off shotgun sitting there with a pair of boots. It's like that thought process was always like appealing to me. Of like Southern Marxists were the Marxists that were like, like I yeah, it is helpful because the people that are around me are not going to side with anything that I would state explicitly. Like, hey, you want to eliminate class? They'd be like, fuck you, right? But if you say like, hey, your boss has dominion over your life, fuck your boss, right? What are we doing about our boss? Shouldn't we do something about that? You get a lot more sympathetic, reception to that sort of thing. And that's part of why I moved back to Texas. Is like, when I was in New York, I helped organize the Hudson Valley CPUSA club,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt a little too easy. It felt like this is supposed to be more difficult, but these people were already kind of leaning in this direction. We're already in agreement about a lot of things, but I know that if I went back to Texas, there'd not only be, the depoliticized proles like you mentioned, or the people that are just, spouting the things their fathers said, which are more than likely conservative Republican talking points. But there's geography that sets you apart from like-minded individuals. Like being like the at-large organizer in Texas at times. It's like what are you supposed to do with a guy that's in Cuero, Texas, when you're in Corpus Christi, and there's one other guy in like, something like Alpine, Texas, or something. It's like there's like hundreds of miles. You're not going to get these three people in a room, once a month. That's not going to happen. And the conversations that need to happen here are more difficult and require more tact. And so maybe it's through being familiar with how one needs to move in this incredibly hostile terrain, how one brings up these topics in conversation. It's like I'm already, schooled with a lot of these tricks. Just like, I got to do the same thing. I got to talk to people about this shit. And, and I got to do it in a way that's not going to make them think automatically that I'm out to, starve 500,000 people or something. That's where they go with you bring out the C word. So yeah, Dugin, he's got a lot of rhetorical tricks, and he also speaks a number of different languages, and he code switches very seamlessly depending on what audience he's speaking to.
Yeah, that's becoming clear to me as I read the book. Like the people who are skilled enough in the different, because I'm like, he speaks post-structuralism for one thing. He speaks aughts and aught teens geopolitics even in the West. Like he speaks internet leftist, even from the aughts. I mean, like not so much modern internet leftism, but he speaks that word. He's very familiar with fascism in ways that most Western non-fascist scholars are not and
Mhm.
cannot cite. I mean, so much so that I know he's being misleading on certain things, because sometimes he'll present like fascism and it's like, oh, it's just racialist, that's its real sin. And I'm like, that's a liberal standpoint and he knows better. And I know he knows better because I know who he's citing. So
Mhm.
like that's a dishonest talk. But if you don't know, and who fucking knows that, like you basically have to be a humanities major who also was a right winger at one point of his life and is familiar with the far left. And also, it helps if you know a little bit something about Russian Marxism.
Well, it's
Like,
also, yeah, like it's also like Teitelbaum, dude. The only reason why he wrote his book and brought all this shit to attention is because he was paying attention to a Bannon speech where Bannon mentioned the phrase that Trump was a man in time, and he caught that out of a phrase from Savitri Devi. And then so he decided to speak to Bannon. He has 20 on the hour or on the record hours of interviews with Bannon. And he brought that up. And he saw that Bannon was familiar with Evola and with Savitri Devi. And even at the end of his book, he posits that that Bannon is a what he calls an esoteric Hitlerist, following the teachings of Savitri Devi. And I know that's wild. It's wild. But that's basically what he throws up in the air. They're like, hey, did we have an esoteric Hitlerist that was like believing in the Kali Yuga and the destruction of end days? And, all was he really like an accelerationist? Like that's what, Teitelbaum says in his book is really what happened. That's where he leaves it hanging.
yeah, if people want to read on radical traditionalism from scholars, the Teitelbaum book is good. The two Mark Sedgwick books, the Against the Modern World and Traditionalism, and then he's got a book of essays that's written by a bunch of people. Those are good. And I don't know. Right-wing critics of American conservatism is a book that is not written by a leftist. It's not written. I can't remember its author off the top of my head. It's actually very good because it documents all of these movements and includes libertarianism as one of them. But it documents neo-reactionaryism, the alt-right, the various forms of paleo-conservatism, esoteric Hitlerism's in there a little bit as part of neo reaction. Like there are these movements, and what I find interesting is when the conservative establishment was stronger, they kept that stuff out. I mean, what did Buckley do? Anyone who got near that, it wasn't that Buckley was an anti-racist, but William Buckley knew that anyone who got near, Francis Yockey or anything like that, like Joe Sobran or Sam Francis, he was going to kick out because it made it too obvious.
Yeah.
So, and when with and I think people still don't really understand how, particularly now that liberals have kind of softened Bush, like this great softening of Bush that's happened in the past during the Trump administration. I will never forgive a lot of liberals for that because I still am like, Bush's body count's higher than Trump's. I don't care.
Mhm.
But in a very real sense, though, the Bush administration was a failure for conservatism that was actually kind of world historical, in so much that from like the late 1970s until the Bush administration, all American politics was reacting to movement conservatism. They were setting the tone, right? After 2007, that is not true anymore. The Tea Party, is its own weird thing, and now you get liberals who are nostalgic for that old movement conservatism because this other shit's weirder.
Yeah.
But in a way, like, they also have gone through their crisis, and I think you see it in the House of Representatives right now. They're fucking way more, like, as much as the Democrats were completely dysfunctional during the Biden administration, which they were. The House Republicans, with their various whatevers, even the reactionary parts of it, cannot agree on a goddamn thing.
It's true. Yeah.
So it shows you how fractured this all is right now. And it shows you why it feels like a moment where some outsider who has that's a conservatism that we wouldn't recognize. As I always say, leftists are often bad at not of recognizing conservatism from another culture. We just don't know what it is.
I want to bring up that. Do you remember Madison Cawthorn? He was right. That dude was brought to Russia. Was he? He went to Russia at one point, and I want to say that the Republicans sort of booted him out by exposing pictures of him, like having just blackmail material on him, and so like there was, for as much dysfunction as we talk about within what's going on in the House of Representatives, like they still know how to get someone out of their party, which is like, you think about someone like the Democrats can't even get past a fucking parliamentarian, or like a Joe Manchin type of character. They have this revolving door of a bad guy that prevents any substantive policy holding true promises to like their constituents, right? And it just anyway. So I just thought I would first, because I think there's some Russia shit going on there too with like Madison that way. So yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say though about the Democrats is, I mean, not to sound like Jimmy Dore, but to be okay with sounding like Jimmy Dore just on this one issue.
Yeah.
I sometimes think that their strategic inability to deal with their own parliamentarian is actually like on purpose.
On purpose,
like,
yeah.
You also see this with the squad. Like the squad that actually believes what it says either comes from like mostly immigrant communities where they're going to be protected by that. That's Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, also two of the squad members that I don't totally hate. Or they're going to be primaried to shit him back, like Cori Bush, who's just probably going to lose. Are they kiss the ring like AOC did immediately? So it is the definition of a control opposition. And then you have this other control opposition that like, well, Joe Manchin won't let us do this, even though he's going to fuck you anyway and like throw a state to a Republican anyhow. So you might as well primary him. But you don't do that for whatever reason. And I will say this, you are right that House Republicans would have primaried his ass. And for good and ill. I mean, I think this, leads us in an interesting spot. We can wrap up here. We've been talking for about 2.5 hours, and but I wanted to ask you, like, I'm going to have you back on the show, on the main show, to talk more about like where your politics are right now, because you've been on a kind of journey for the last year, particularly going back to Texas. But I wanted to ask you, like, where do you also feel like we're in a moment, and I don't just mean about this Dugin stuff, just in general, where most of the left has kind of lost hope and moved right wing for various reasons. And a lot of it, I would actually say a lot of these people would not recognize that they've moved right. I would also say that, like, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't know it. They're not, like, they might be pretty far along before they admit to themselves that they've like given up a lot of their prior beliefs. How do you think we should handle that, given that we are likely to see this go back on pause if Trump wins the next election, where I don't think it's going to look like the resistance did from 2016 to 2020, because that's exhausted, but people are going to go back into that opposition mode and it's going to freeze us again. And a lot of people are going to go counter-cyclic to the president. That's how a lot of this politics works. But that's going to give people kind of a false, like, my fear during the Trump administration is the resistance to Trump created a false feeling that the left had a lot more power than it did, because we were actually out there really opposing Trump, whereas the liberals kind of were.
I mean, a lot of this depends on if the liberals wake up again, because if like, that's what gives us this false impression that we have the numbers, when those numbers go dormant the moment there's not bad men in charge, and so, like, are we at a point where some of us have moved right? Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of us that have kind of lost focus and there's the clown shoes left, which never had focus. Right. But there's, there are powerful. Yeah, tell me.
No, no. I would also say maybe one thing I'll add is there's a lot of us who move right, and there's a lot of us who just drop the fuck out. Like I was thinking about Max Elbaum's book on Revolution of the Year and what happened with the New Communist Movement. Now I'm not a fan of a lot of the New Communist Movement. I'll admit that, but I'm always fascinated by. We never talk about what happened. They didn't die. Like they were in their 20s. They just did. They did. A lot of them became good Democrats. Some became reactionaries, but most of them just went away. Just like went into private life.
Man, politics is the house of the lonely, man. It's like you come to politics because you feel like you have experienced some kind of injustice. And so you fight back against that. And maybe politics for some people is only as far as their own grievance. It requires a resolve, requires some sort of resolution, I feel like 2008 is like the housing crisis is like a big scar on the American psyche that we never really fully addressed. We never, went through like national counseling on what it was like to have, the American dream sort of, put a dagger in it, basically, if it wasn't dead already, right? So homes taken away from people. Max has this whole life's work, arguably, based on like, Max Alvarez, the guy that I produced for with the Real News Network, man. Like his whole thing came out of the housing crisis in 2008. And so are people
now we have
moving?
The opposite housing crisis, but it's actually still a result of the old one in a way.
Yeah. And I was saying 2 years ago, it felt like 2008 again. Like there's, and I what is going on, man? TikTok had all these like videos about how there's an impending housing crisis, and now that's gone. There's nobody talking about an impending housing crisis right now, but there's still a gigantic cost of living and housing crisis. And, all these like Zillow and private, companies are buying up rental shit now. I mean, it's bad shape, man. I think that the way we should handle this, I mean, I hate to, I'm not like a Naomi Klein, fan or anything, but she had a line in a book that said something like our ecological situation has turned what we think of as Marxists as ideological preferences. Why has that not turned our mindset into having them be existential necessities? And that has always sat with me in a certain way. That's like, the vision that I have in terms of my politics, and I think I always aspire to do what Norman Finkelstein says is like, there's not a contradiction between my politics and reality. And like Chuck Levar is saying, it's not my fault if reality is Marxist. Some of us have had our own personal grievances resolved. Some of us got our boomer parents' money. And some of us are just fucking discouraged.
Yeah, a lot of people just giving up because they didn't get anything.
Yeah, and a lot of people just giving up, right? But also, like, what are you doing if you're a Marxist in this? You join a party, but what help is that? I mean, look, man, like part of like in organizing, what kind of grinds my gears and is irritating to me is this need for like fraternization and socialization and camaraderie building. Not because I'm against camaraderie building or hanging out, but God damn it, the planet is dying and we're fucked up right now. And I don't really have time to sit around and like make more comrade friends purely in the spirit of building friendship. Because like, first of all, like dude, what is CPUSA doing right now? Like, what power? We don't have a Labor Party. We don't have it's like we joined this party. We know it's feeble anyway, right? We know we don't have all the power in the world. We know
DSA is going bankrupt as we're talking.
DSA is going right. So yeah. So it's like at one point I thought, hell yeah, I'll join a party. I'll fucking make a club and we'll organize and we'll do. Dude, like, and this is part of why I've been listening to a lot of. I started reading some Byung-Chul Han, and I got some critiques of the dude too, right? But like part of what got me the train that I've been on recently has been more like Marshall McLuhan and Herbert Marcuse, because if the media is the massage, if we're in this hyper media ecosystem, everything's mediated. If you have a platform, you need to speak out. And people listen to things that I say. I somehow made somehow that is true. People listen to things that I say. I create a podcast episode, publish it, and people will listen to it. And I think that's awesome. But I also think that that's far more effective than going to hang out with some comrade friends and build camaraderie or whatever the fuck that, like, I don't have time for that shit, man. It's like I help other people get their messages out that are in support of the working class. There's a one-to-many relationship there. I talk to people like you and other people and publish it on my podcast feeds. People listen to that. I thought a lot about what you said in one of our first interviews, where you said you take content creation and Marxism, being a Marxist, as two separate questions, right? Yeah, totally get that. And I'm not even saying that I haven't made mistakes. Like, I've done shit where I feel I interviewed Grover Fur at one point, dude. Like, dude, like, yeah. I'm willing
I
to.
forgave you.
You forgive me on that, but it's only because I've come around to understanding this stuff now after a greater amount of reading and talking to people and stuff like that. So yeah, we are at a point where like, the people that were major voices in this are not. Some of it, we lost some of them to being, Russia supporters in this whole fucking thing. I stopped paying attention to anybody who was championing Russia's imperial quest in Ukraine. I just was like, no, I'm just not gonna. Like, if you are holding yourself up as an anti-imperialist and then you take the side of an imperialist conquest, I will stop paying attention to what you have to say.
Yeah, I like to quote, when people talk to me about revolutionary defeatism in this, I like to remind them that it was a defeat of both imperial parties that was required for Lenin, and that he actually made it very clear that even national liberation had to go on the back burner about not supporting one empire over the other. In the case of Serbia, go see the fucking letters. It's
there.
It's incredibly clear.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Like, he actually says, like, yes, in a different time we would support Serbia, but at this moment we can't do so without strengthening one imperial power against another. We don't want either one of them to win. Yeah. So, like, by the way, though, conversely, if somehow third campism for you ends up being you end up being a NATO stan, you're also not my friend. And I want it to be said is I don't have a hostility towards Russian people or any of that shit. I can't stand when we, like, conflate, because I don't like it when it happens to me, for one thing. When you conflate someone's, like, the culture that they were born in with the government that they happen to live under. Like, it is like, for example, I used to get a lot of shit for being an American, interestingly, when I was in Korea. But in Mexico, I always used to joke where the anger at America, the American government, is actually much higher. There was a clear, like, well, you might be a dumb American, but you're not to blame for your fucking government.
Right.
And I feel that way about, not to say that the Russian invasion is unpopular in Russia or anything like that either. I'm not going to project something that's not true, but I don't know, man. It's talking about geopolitics with the sufficient nuance is really hard. With the literally the exception is Israel-Palestine, because what's happening in Palestine is just fucking genocide, and it's, like, very clear what it is. But even there, the one thing I'll say is, like, most of the left answers to the problem aren't answers. Like, you're gonna wait for what, a regional war to break out, or you're gonna kick out the settlers. How again? With what army? Because the countries that could help them do that, Russia and China and India, they aren't. Like, I actually was telling someone, like, oh, so multipolarity is going to be good for all these people, right? And, like, Israel can take a hit, right? Well, then why isn't Russia arming the Palestinians right now? Just want to point that out to you. And there are geopolitical reasons for it, one of which is Israel also realizes it's in a multipolar world that's made its technology kind of important to all the major powers, not just the United States. So it's there have been tensions between Russia and Israel emerging because of Russia's geostrategic interest in Iran. Um, but beyond that, um, you know, the 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 uh, the one state that got around a lot of the sanctions legally in the Western bloc that was trading with Russia, they weren't trading weapons and technology, but other stuff, was Israel, right?
Right.
Like, so this is something that I want to tell people to look at when we go into this world, because I think a lot. The other thing I think about a lot of Marxists, why uh, you mentioned the Sorelianism, right? The myth of us having a good guy that we could support, I hate to tell, for most people, is a fucking myth.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't get that through your goddamn skull, you are going to be someone's useful idiot. We are not in the Cold War. This is not the USSR. Like, I'm a defensist towards China, but even there, I'm not uncritical. So
Sure.
it is it is this time, and yet, um, we need a ceasefire, right? So, like, how are you going to get that? And unfortunately, right now, that's going to require, like, putting pressure on conventional politics to get. And is that going to help create communism? No, actually, it's not. And that's not why we do it, because I would like to believe that we realize that some massacres are worth stopping, even if they aren't going to directly lead to the communist future. But nonetheless, and I think I think for a lot of people, Palestine has been clarifying for a lot of Marxists, but it's also been, I mean, it's been this weird point. I guess this is my last thought of where the powerlessness of our politics. I said that leftists have more power, but on this we have none. Um, Popular opinion, even on the fucking right now, is with us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
It's
on
wild.
Palestine, it's
Wild.
wild, and we
Yeah.
have no effect.
Nope.
Even though, like, so I keep on telling people, quit thinking this is a hearts and minds game. The general population, even on the right, all right, is now with us. They think that the slaughter of the Palestinians is too fucking much,
Mm-hmm.
and yet we can't do that much to do anything about it. Like, it's, yeah, Biden will occasionally seemingly step in to kind of slowly wag his finger and be like, hey, don't start global nuclear war, please, in your slaughtering of these women and children in Gaza.
Did they bomb Gaza while they were in like a meeting to determine how they're going to retaliate against Iran?
Yeah.
Which is like, and I would love to have a separate conversation with you at some point, vis-a-vis like Christopher Lasch culture of narcissism stuff, because I feel like, I mean, this is getting a little afield, man, but I've done a lot of research on narcissism, and I've looked at some of the stuff that Lasch has written pointing to the rise of this within American culture. And I see some of this sort of pathological behavior scaled up to like, the comportment of nations in some ways. Whether it's like, some of the standard sort of psychological attributes of this stuff, whether like entitlement, self-importance, always being right, always evading responsibility, splitting with all bad or all good, lots of cognitive distortions. But like, there's this whole concept of Lash, I think, bleeds into some of the Byung-Chul Han stuff, in that, like, and it also points to, like, it kind of includes some of Dugin's criticisms of the West, in that, like, consumerism, materialism, and sort of the poverty of American culture, Western culture, as he would point out, has developed a sort of self-eating, rampant individualism, that, so I think about all of that in terms of, like, what other nation would, like, get retaliated against by Iran, have the US be like, hey, dude, we'll help you shoot these rockets down, but we're not going to engage with you in a joint, like, retaliation. Yeah, I guess it's okay if you continue bombing, Gaza, while you determine a sort of really bad idea of a retaliation that could start World War III. Like this is all sorts of crazy geopolitical enabling that is like far beyond I think anything we've ever seen. Really, like I can't name any other time.
No, I
You
mean
know,
it. Well, for those people, from 2019 to 2021, who's like, oh, what about the international rules-based order? I'm like, woof. One, we destroyed that in 2003. Let's be
yeah,
honest.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
two, like, we clearly don't give a shit. We do care about starting a massive global nuclear war, but that's really it. And
Well, you imagine if the Soviet Union allowed Finland to like just fuck around and create like a whole new world war or something. I mean, I just the analogies seem ridiculous, but I kind of feel like that's the closest thing I can think of. You know?
well, it's wild to me that, for example, Reagan could raise a phone call in 1983, but Biden can't do it now, despite the fact that like it might cause him to lose. I mean, like that Trump and him are so close. And look, as a communist, I would like to say I actually don't have huge stakes in who wins this, but I think it's bad either way. I'm going to be unhappy with either president,
Yeah.
but not to say that they're exactly. I know I'm going to get no. No, you're equivocating them.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
I don't want to play that
Whatever.
game.
Yeah.
But uh, in a very real sense, like I actually said something the other day. I was looking at someone and I was like, look, man, the IDF's on fucking TikTok has made WikiLeaks irrelevant, because it'd be like if the US military was putting its atrocities on TikTok itself,
Yeah.
and then being like, why is everyone mad at us? We're just laughing at shooting children. I mean, like,
It's yeah. Yeah.
it actually makes the brazenness of American empire seem not that brazen. Like, I was sort of like, my God, like Israel has kind of made the U.S. empire look terrible because we're backing them, but also like we were not that like fucking like just grotesquely obvious about it. Like,
Yeah. Well,
and
this is like also like part of like going back to the shit. It's like like there's a scene in what was it like No Country for Old Men where like the dude kills somebody and then like he has a glass of milk in their front room kind of thing, and it's just all the more disturbing that the killer kind of settled and made that his domain for a second, and I kind of feel like it's kind of like not only can we kill you, but we can be ostentatious about the way we celebrate this shit in like a very sort of serial killer establishing dominant sort of awful way. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like I couldn't imagine what do you think would happen in this day and age if like a United States soldier overseas killed a child and posted it on TikTok? Do you think like we'd have all sorts of people in our political institutions being pissed off about that, or because like
absolutely,
this is
I
like
think
this is like something I've talked about with my friend David Parsons. He said that like in his career of being a professor, 2001, it became quite a shock at Abu Ghraib that we were torturing people. And students at that point were like, no way, that's terrible. And they took all sorts of stances against it, right? But 2020 comes around and like, hey, do you know that we torture we torture prisoners of war? And students were like, yeah, of course we do. What the fuck, yeah. So like this sort of instantiation of the IDF doing this on TikTok. I mean, I know we're worried about like, you mentioned international rules order and how we destroyed that in 2003. And we're all like, oh no, Israel has destroyed part of that by bombing an embassy. But what kind of precedent does this set with broadcasting shit on TikTok for this stuff, man? Like,
what it does is it means we're back at World War II levels of being obvious about it. Like, and we're also at World War II levels of death. So, as I like to say, suck it, Steven Pinker. You're just wrong.
yeah.
This whole like we're all just getting better in a Whiggish move of history is bullshit, and this proves it.
Yeah.
Because this is a fucking slaughter. And I mean, the thing is, I think it's really hard to look at because there's not like we want to believe that there'll be a Palestinian revolution tomorrow, but the odds without international intervention are really low. That there's anything anyone can do, and the incentives aren't there either. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, like, so it's gonna get ugly, man. I mean, if I had a prediction, I think we might see this ramp down. I'm very hesitant to predict war shit though, because I've been wrong a lot on war stuff. Because I always assume people are going to be more rational than they are. Like I'm always like, no one like this is obviously a bad deal. People are that nope, I'm wrong. People are going to do the thing. I mean, the only time that I have been right is like, mad, even though the general public has forgotten it, has not left the minds of our warlords. Like they do realize that nuclear armed states will destroy each other. That is clear. That is still like the one thing that's keeping us from just all out barbarism in a very fucked up way. But and I get that. I mean, I get like, to bring it back to Dugin, seeing that shit, like you want to side with anybody who'll stop that shit. Like, like what is some like Palestinian 15-year-old ever done to me? Nothing. Um, uh, like, no, I mean, like, look, we can get into the larger problems of Palestine. If it did have independence, is it a viable state? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, those are huge problems that they're not here to answer today. I can't answer them for anyone. But I will just say, like, the apartheid before October 7th was unfucking unconscionable, and the fact that we, just the kind of like, yes, when Israel would do something obvious or world would protest about it, but then we kind of forget. Post October 7th is like the entire world's, it's got to be one thing. It's got to be weird to be a Palestinian. Is like the world is not watching and go, yes, they are. And they might, and like the general public's actually kind of on our side, and yet it's not stopping us from getting killed. That's got to be like, I can't imagine what that does to your psyche. Like, to be like, even the fucking world finally seeing us for what we are, and they don't hate us anymore, and yet it doesn't matter. Like, and in some ways, for me, that's why we're in the darkest timeline. It's just like that, and that's why this right wing shit's gonna come up, because a friend of mine put it to me in another way. When people give up hope, they go to pragmatism, and when they are afraid, they become conservative, like temperamentally. I don't necessarily mean ideologically, but temperamentally. Sure. You add those two things together, you're going to get a reactionary politics. You just are. Like,
as we continue to see the U.S. shut down and what the Red Sea or something by the Houthis, and they take these sort of like L's from the Middle East, and Iran firing at their vassal state now, and the impending election coming through, the chaos. I mean, as this all continues, I think we're going to see more aggravated sort of.
Yeah, what I think about the current thing with Israel? I think what the U.S. is afraid of, and why they're enabling it so much, is that they're afraid that they don't actually have a vassal state, that they're not actually really in control. I think they're afraid, even though the chance of Netanyahu actually doing this is still really small, but that Netanyahu might just go, no. Like, we said we have enough bombs to kill it out to you. Did you forget you gave us a nuke? Like, like that's the thing that makes me wonder what's going through their head. If I'm modeling what they're thinking, I'm like, yeah, it's a vast state, but like the U.S. empire has never wanted to be this blatant before. Like,
and how much do the injuries to the United States affect that perception that they have a vassal state, right? So like, that the United States is going through political tumult right now, and they seem to, their navy's been shut down by the Houthis in a way. It's like, how much does that contribute towards Netanyahu's willingness to go rogue away from, out of step with what the United States wants to?
Who knows? A ton. I mean, The one thing I will say about the current moment, and this is one of the results of multipolarity in a real sense, is like cards are off the table about where people may go, and alliances are going to get fucking weird.
Yeah.
Like the Middle East is a prime example of this, because outside of everybody being pissed off about what Israel's doing, like Syria, which is also pretty fucking bloody, like who's siding with whom on Syria on any given day is hard to keep up with
Yeah.
in the Middle East. Like it's changing all the goddamn time. And I mean, I make a morbid joke, but that like everyone in the Middle East just uses Syria as a pincushion for bombs, depending on who's pissing them off that day. Like you want to fuck with the Kurds, you can do it in Syria. You want to fuck with the Alawites, you can do it in Syria. You want to fuck with the Shia, you can do it in Syria. You want to fuck with the Sunni, you can do it in Syria. Like it's just. And oh yeah, are you both Sunni, but you're a different kind of Sunni? Are you a Qatari Sunni? Are you a Saudi Sunni? Where you can fuck with each other in Syria? Like it's crazy. And I mean that's when I talk about the multipolar world, and this will be my last point, and I'll turn it back over to you. I think it's important that we think about what that multipolarity will be, because historically speaking, having multiple great empires is a bunch of fucking war.
Yeah.
Like that's what it is. Unipolar world, also a bunch of fucking war, because they just kind of trample over everybody. The bipolar world was stable until, and honestly, until the Sino-Soviet split fucked it up. Like it was stable. And I don't want to get like, I know we're now relitigating the Sino-Soviet split. We're over 3 hours, and I don't want to fucking get into that.
Yeah.
But like, it was stable. Now, this is stable good? No, actually, I don't want to like for working classness. The bipolar world was actually not great.
Right.
Like, it created an illusion that we could actually win through like cooperating, which that led to Fordism. And what is neoliberalism but Fordism when you take the stool out from the working class and let them fall? Like, and that was the great illusion of that time period, right? But like, yeah, and I just think we're gonna cut right wing. We've been all over the place. What's your last word, Jules? You're gonna be back on the show soon, anyway.
I'll be back on, man. Thank you for the invite again, man. It's always good talking to you, Derek. Man, I think as a last thought, I think, a lot of us, I say, and maybe myself included. Like my show took a bit of a hiatus just because I was like, I had a ton of other projects going on. I managed to shoot a film somewhere in there too that I'm still working towards finishing. It's been a lot of creativity. I wrote like 25 songs in the month of January.
Wow.
It's like something absurd. It's been like levels of prolificity that I have not ever encroached before. And the show is kind of backish. I'm out of secret projects to reveal at this point. Like I got nothing in the back pocket. But yeah, I mean, this Dugin stuff, I'm really happy to I mean, would say I'm really happy to talk about it with you. Happy is not the correct word to use there. But it's something that stays in my mind, that I've followed, that I mostly, because of the ways that Dugin seems to be a slippery character that slides in and slides out and leaves behind language and perspectives that are not in line with our total project. I think a lot of this, man, we'd be more immune to this, both immune to Dugin and immune to losing focus on the ball, if we had a more adequate worldview for what the scope and intentions are for Marxism in terms of a global perspective that eclipses this, sort of like very cursory sort of aspirations of just free college and healthcare. It needs to be a global sort of perspective on like, we're going to end exploitation. We're going to do that by uniting the global South, whatever perspective you want to put in there, right? But just something more than free college and healthcare and maybe a labor party or something like. And I think that the failure to think through that and to hold that is partly why comrades get frustrated, lose hope, get assuaged to other ideologies. And but I'm also kind of black pilled too, man, because like, what does it fucking matter? We're gonna die of climate change. It's like I don't have a kid right now because well, first of all, I didn't want to have kids for whatever reasons. But if I had a kid and be like, you have fun growing old and watching the oceans almost boil, hopefully your kids will get to watch the oceans boil or something. It's like it's a really grim outlook down there in the world right now. And so part of me is thinking that the moment that we're in, like I said earlier, needs to take what feels like ideological preferences and turn them into existential necessities. And part of me knows that the people that are mostly responsible for this have names and addresses. And there's a meme floating around recently that says, not everything can be decolonized. Some shit's got to burn. And that's kind of where I'm at with this stuff too. And I don't know that I have a whole lot of hope towards like the completion of or like I'm not in the school of thought of like inevitability on any of this stuff. I'm also not in the school of thought of like men being acorns and history being oak trees, and it's not a linear progress, and we can regress, and we are regressing, and it's looking more like barbarism than socialism right now. But while we're here, we have to contribute towards planting the seeds of trees of shade that we'll never sit in, and it's a protracted people's war that is across generations. And the only thing we can hope to do is forward that. And, regretfully, I find that maybe one of the most effective means I have towards forwarding this shit is talking on a podcast. And nothing against podcasts. I just wish that it was more, I don't know, more substantial than that. But it's meager offerings of one person at this point. What can I say? I'm just like trying to, and part of me also thought like, dude, there are scholars and historians and learned people in the world that write books that never get a single reader, and they all contribute towards like in the same way that musicians contributed towards like the Spotify streaming digital ether of albums that are never listened to and shit. So do scholars and learned people everywhere contribute to this stuff, right? So like I think all of us need to get past whatever imposter syndrome we have and pick up a mic and start blasting out into the podcast world in a one-to-many sort of way, because I think part of class consciousness comes through recognition.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we can, I hope it, I hope recognition somehow turns what we're discussing with the Palestinian people, how world opinion is on their side, but it's not really doing anything for them. I hope that we can get some sort of elevated recognition as a collective that we're all feeling the same way. We're all mostly in agreement and have more that ties together than that set us apart. And we just need to come together and demand what we are due, what we are owed, what we deserve. And that's where my focus is on a sort of working class, classical Marxism. Like you said, I think I'm kind of done being an anti-imperialist first over, a class-based Marxist. Because I've found that, like you said, the epiphenomenal part of like our conditions, it's slippery, man. People like Dugin come in and recruit you. And before Dugin was recruiting out of anti-imperialism, I'm sure there were others doing the same thing. That seems to be a vulnerable entryway into all this stuff.
Yeah, Francis Shockey, etc. All right, thank you so much, Jules, and we'll end there for today.
Sounds